If you enjoy waking up before the birds, congratulations, you're already halfway to becoming a monk. The other half is giving up sleep entirely, because medieval monastic life didn't believe in something as indulgent as a full night's rest. No, monks weren't about that cozy 8 hours with a warm blanket nonsense. They were more into spiritual exhaustion with a splash of holy scheduling. Your alarm clock, a giant iron bell that sounds like divine judgment. Your snooze button, a sin. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval monastery, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's talk about the schedule, or as monks called it, the divine office, also known as liturgy of the hours, also known as the reason your eyeballs never stop twitching. The day was chopped up into sacred segments called canonical hours, 8 of them to be precise, and monks were expected to stop whatever they were doing and pray at these very specific, often absurd times. Think of it like a divine group chat that kept pinging all day and all night. The night is quiet, the world sleeps. The monk does not. This is when the first bell rings, jolting you from your straw-stuffed mattress if you're lucky enough to even have one, and pulling you into the cold stone chapel to chant psalms in the dark. Why? Because praying in the dead of night was seen as particularly pious. Also, apparently, God doesn't sleep either. Relatable modern equivalent. Trying to meditate after 2 hours of sleep and 3 nightmares about your high school math teacher. Congratulations, you've barely finished matins and it's already time for Lords. That's right, just enough time to splash your face with freezing water, possibly stub your toe on a wooden bench, and then go praise the sunrise. Lords was about praising the dawn, because nothing says good morning like chanting in Latin while your stomach sounds like an angry beehive. Ah, prime. The hour where the sun finally peaks over the horizon and you start thinking, maybe I'll get a nap. You won't. You absolutely won't. This prayer marked the official start of the day's labor. Yes, after all that midnight devotion, this is when your workday begins. Did you want to copy a manuscript, milk a goat, tend the turnip patch? Fantastic. Get to it, but be prepared to stop again soon, because the next bell is just around the corner. Now, before you start clutching your modern espresso machine in horror, let's be clear, this happened every single day. Sundays, holidays, feast days, no exceptions. The only thing that changed was maybe how many extra prayers were added, because clearly 7 hours of chanting wasn't cutting it. The full prayer breakdown went like this. Matins, middle of the night. Lords, early morning. Prime, dawn. Terce, mid-morning. None, mid-afternoon. Vespers, evening. Compline, just before bed. It's less a schedule and more a divine obstacle course. Blink and you've missed a prayer. Miss 2, and you might get a stern talk from Brother Gregory, who hasn't blinked since 1193. Monks were permitted only about 4 to 6 hours of interrupted sleep per day, and even that was considered generous. They practiced something called segmented sleep, which is just a fancy way of saying you sleep in chunks and never feel rested again. Imagine trying to function while being perpetually under-caffeinated, underfed, and over-pious. Monks weren't just tired, they were spiritually exhausted and quietly humming Gregorian chants in their sleep. Their bedrooms, by the way, weren't rooms at all. They slept in a shared dormitory, fully clothed, often on wooden boards with maybe some straw, because mattresses were for weak-willed nobles and backsliders. The idea was that physical comfort distracted from spiritual devotion. So if you're the kind of person who needs 2 pillows, blackout curtains, and a sound machine just to nap, monastic life would chew you up and chant you out. The monastery bell didn't just ring, it dominated. It governed everything. It was your boss, your calendar, and your spiritual cattle prod. And monks had to respond to it immediately. If you were halfway through eating, you dropped your bread. If you were gardening, you dropped your hoe. If you were sleeping, you dropped your soul back into your aching body and dragged it to the chapel. Every hour was a reminder that your time was not your own. It belonged to God, and God, apparently, was extremely type A. This wasn't just some medieval flex. The point of all this structured chaos was discipline. Monks believed the regular rhythm of prayer molded the soul, trained the body, and kept the mind focused on the divine. Their time wasn't meant for self-expression or leisure. It was meant to mirror heaven's eternal order, which is beautiful, and also a little terrifying when you realize it comes with 2 a.m. wake-up calls and the smell of incense in your sinuses for life. So, could you last a day in a medieval monastery? Well, if you can wake up at 2 a.m., chant in Latin on an empty stomach, pray 8 times a day, work between prayers, sleep on a wooden slab, and never once say, "I miss coffee," then maybe, just maybe, you'll survive. But for the rest of us, one toll of the bell, and we're spiritually ghosting the entire monastery. You may think you love peace and quiet until you accidentally fart in the chapel, and it echoes like the voice of God. Welcome to the world of enforced medieval silence, where words were suspicious, noise was frowned upon, and vocal cords were pretty much on sabbatical. In a monastery, the loudest sound you were supposed to make was your own internal guilt. The rule of Saint Benedict, basically the medieval monk instruction manual, had a lot to say about not saying much at all. According to this foundational guide, silence wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was a spiritual necessity. The idea was that talking less meant sinning less. After all, you can't lie, gossip, complain, or curse the cold stew if your mouth is sealed tighter than a wine cask in Lent. Silence was seen as a shield against temptation, a path to humility, and a way to keep the monastic community focused on God instead of Brother Thomas's riveting opinion about turnip farming. But here's the fun part. Monks still had jobs to do, tasks to complete, and thoughts to share. You can't run an entire abbey on good vibes and grimaces alone. So they did what any spiritually repressed group of medieval men would do. They invented monastic charades. Yes, hand signs. An entire non-verbal language system emerged within monasteries to get through the day without breaking the vow of silence. There were signs for food items, mime munching for bread, 2 fingers for peas, for prayer, a solemn nod and clasped hands, and even for tools or chores. Want to ask for the broom? Better start miming like you're in a one-man theatrical production called Dusting for God. These signs varied between monasteries, so if you visited another abbey and tried to sign cheese, you might accidentally insult someone's mother. The communication system became so complex that entire manuals were written just to document the gestures. Imagine flipping through a medieval flipbook showing how to silently indicate, "Brother Stephen has once again forgotten to feed the chickens." Now imagine trying to do it with a straight face while dressed in a woolen habit, in a room that smells like old parchment and boiled leeks. And yet it worked. Sort of. The unspoken code allowed monks to get by, but it wasn't exactly foolproof. Misunderstandings happened. One overly enthusiastic hand sign, and suddenly someone thinks you're requesting a funeral mass instead of lunch. Still, it was better than breaking the sacred sound barrier. Of course, silence wasn't enforced 24/7. Certain areas and times permitted limited speech, like during confession or formal meetings. But most of the day was spent in a kind of sacred hush. The refectory dining hall was a prime example. No chatter over breakfast, no gossip during dinner. Instead, one monk would read aloud from scripture or a sermon, while the others quietly chewed their stew and meditated on eternal salvation, or how much they missed salt. But as serene as this sounds, total silence had its less than divine effects. For some, it became a kind of psychological endurance test. Monks couldn't express frustration, crack a joke, or even vent about the guy next to them breathing too loudly. Emotions were meant to be swallowed like cold porridge quickly, and with no complaints. Over time, that kind of internal bottling could turn even the holiest of brothers into a silent stew of passive-aggressive sighs. Then there was the added social tension. Silence doesn't eliminate drama. It just makes it quieter and weirder. If you have ever experienced someone pointedly ignoring you, you already understand medieval monastic. You couldn't talk behind someone's back, but you could certainly pray at them with some intensity. Subtle glances, prolonged eye contact, and perhaps the occasional not-so-gentle closing of a chapel door became passive warfare. Monks didn't argue, they just judged each other wordlessly for 30 years. Still, for all its discomforts, silence was more than a quirky custom. It was a spiritual exercise designed to redirect attention inward. The theory was, if you could shut out the noise of the world, you'd hear the divine more clearly. Whether that divine voice came with peace, purpose, or a mild existential crisis, that was up to the monk. Some even grew to love it. After a while, silence didn't feel like deprivation. It felt like freedom. No small talk, no awkward conversations, no need to explain why you looked tired. Spoiler, everyone was tired. Just stillness. Some monks reportedly went decades without speaking, and when one of them did finally utter a word, it usually wasn't hello. It was something cryptic like, "The fig tree bears fruit in silence," and then they'd float off into the mist. In the end, silence wasn't just about not speaking, it was about listening to the bell, to your soul, to the barely audible shuffle of a dozen sandaled feet walking in harmony. And sure, it also meant that every bodily sound was a potential public embarrassment. But, if humiliation brought humility, the monks were well on their way to sainthood. Fashion tip: if you're aiming for celibate hermit, the look is flawless. Medieval monks were not exactly known for their sense of style. That's because style, in the modern sense, expressing your personality through clothing, finding a cut that flatters your figure, choosing colors that say approachable but mysterious, was basically outlawed behind cloister walls. Monastic fashion was not about turning heads. It was about lowering them in prayer, preferably while draped in something that felt like it was woven from itchy self-discipline and existential regret. The go-to monk outfit was called a habit, and there was nothing habitual about comfort. These robes were typically made from wool, and not the soft, cozy kind your modern sweater boasts about. No, this was the original, aggressively rustic, scratchy wool that made you feel like you were being mildly punished just for wearing it. And in a way, you were. The whole point of the habit was to remind you that pleasure was a distraction, and that meant every thread was woven with good intentions and terrible texture. The design was simple: a long tunic, a cowl, a sort of hooded cloak, and sometimes a scapula, a long cloth that draped over the shoulders like a medieval sandwich board of humility. The sleeves were long and wide, excellent for hiding hands during silent prayers, or more realistically for catching on every doorknob and candle in the monastery. Color options? Don't even think about it. You got what your order dictated. Benedictine went with black, because why not look as somber as your soul feels? Constarians chose undyed white or greyish wool, giving off the vibe of a haunted scarecrow who regrets nothing except maybe joining the Constarians. Franciscans wore brown, because the only thing more humble than mud is being dressed like it. Belts were simple ropes or cords. No buckles, no ornamentation, just a humble loop of rope to tie your spiritual life and your robe together. If it looks like something a shepherd would wear while fasting, you're doing it right. Now let's talk about footwear, or lack thereof. Some orders permitted sandals, thick, leather soles, strapped with devotion, and possibly the remnants of last week's lentils. Others went barefoot, a decision that was both spiritually profound and medically inadvisable in the age of mystery puddles and sharp mystery objects. But perhaps the most iconic and unsettling fashion feature was the tonsure. This is the infamous haircut, where monks shaved the top of their head bald and left a fringe of hair around the sides like a human halo that's slowly giving up. The tonsure served as a visual sign of humility and religious devotion. It said, "I've renounced vanity louder than any vow ever could, mainly because people couldn't look away from your shining, vulnerable scalp." There were different styles of tonsure depending on the order and the region. Some monks shaved a perfect circle on the crown, while others left a small tuft like a confused pigeon had tried to nest there and got bored halfway through. In either case, it was less fashion-forward and more haircut by theological committee. Why the tonsure at all? Because it physically marked you as different, as someone set apart from worldly concerns. The idea was that monks were spiritually removed from society and therefore they shouldn't resemble it, which, when you're already dressed like a sack of devotion and haven't smiled since Epiphany, probably didn't require the extra cue. But just in case someone missed it, there was the haircut. Clothing in monastic life wasn't meant to flatter, it was meant to erase, to strip away ego, vanity, individuality. One robe for all, no flair, no embroidered initials, no sash that says blessed but fashionable, just the basics, intentionally boring. To dress like a monk was to become a walking sermon about renunciation. Every thread said, I am not the point. And while we might find that bleak, or just deeply itchy, it also meant monks were free from the fashion rat race. No seasonal trends, no wardrobe envy, no need to panic because Brother Ambrose just showed up in a velvet doublet and suddenly your tunic feels last century. Monks wore the same thing every day, year in and year out, and no one cared if it was flattering. Honestly, Steve Jobs would have been proud. Still, this humble uniform had its own kind of power. In a world obsessed with status, monks declared their separation from all that through fabric. Nobles wore gold-threaded brocade. Merchants showed off their wealth in color and lace. But monks wrapped themselves in simplicity and said, this is enough. Although, let's be honest, if you're modern and accidentally stylish, you wouldn't last 10 minutes. If you've ever picked an outfit based on how good it makes your ankles look, monastery life might come as a spiritual and polyester-free shock. You're allowed beer for breakfast but don't celebrate, it tastes like disappointment and barley sadness. Monastic food was not designed to excite. It was designed to not excite, which is a shame. Because if you're going to be waking up at 2 in the morning to pray in the dark and wearing a woolen robe that feels like penance by the yard, a comforting breakfast might seem like the universe's smallest consolation prize. Instead, welcome to the medieval monastic meal plan, where the flavor is minimal, the texture is suspicious, and the portion sizes are spiritually character-building. First things first, monks were not allowed meat, well, sort of. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed the daily life of monks across Europe, specifically banned the consumption of four-legged animals for those in the main monastery. Birds and fish? Sure. Sheep, pigs, cows, off the divine menu. Meat was considered too luxurious, too rich, and too likely to awaken carnal desires. And we can't have Brother Matthew getting excited over a drumstick now, can we? That said, there were loopholes. Monks who were ill or weak, or just really good at spiritual side-eye, might be served meat in a separate area called the infirmary, which was supposed to be reserved for the sick. Conveniently, some monks seemed to come down with mysterious ailments just before roast goose season. Coincidence? Unlikely, but plausible enough to keep their conscience and their appetite quiet. For everyone else it was legumes, grains and bread. Lots and lots of bread. If bread had a frequent flyer program, monks would have racked up points into sainthood. This bread wasn't the fluffy bakery kind either. It was dark, dense, and had the consistency of something between a roof tile and a chewy sermon. Add to that a spoonful of beans and the occasional turnip stew, and you've got yourself a holy meal, so bland it could make a carrot feel spicy. Breakfast, or as it was sometimes called, collation, was usually light, if it happened at all. Some monasteries didn't allow food before noon, especially on fast days, which occurred so often it's a miracle anyone had enough energy to chant at all. But when breakfast was allowed, it might consist of yesterday's bread dipped in weak ale or watered-down wine. The ale was brewed in-house and had little alcohol, but lots of bitter regret. It wasn't meant to intoxicate, it was meant to hydrate, because medieval water was often less refreshing beverage and more cryptic disease smoothie. Now, before you romanticize the idea of monks brewing beer, know this. Monastic beer was rarely the rich golden stuff that people pay top dollar for today. No, breakfast beer was usually gruel in disguise, murky, warm, slightly sour, and probably home to a few floating mysteries. It tasted like barley's final cry before fermentation. On feast days, meals were slightly upgraded. Maybe some fresh cheese, boiled eggs, or a slightly better stew. But even then, moderation ruled. Monks were expected to eat just enough to keep going, but never enough to feel satisfied. Fullness was frowned upon. Eating to the point of pleasure? Borderline heretical. So even when food was better, the guilt garnish was strong. And of course, we can't forget the fasting rules. Fasting was a cornerstone of monastic discipline. During Lent and other holy seasons, food was further reduced, sometimes to just one small meal a day. Monks would go without meat, dairy, and even oil. Imagine being hungry, cold, and spiritually scrutinized for considering a walnut. If you accidentally ate something too rich, you were expected to confess it like a sin. "Forgive me, Father, for I ate half a boiled egg before Terce." Meals were eaten in strict silence, no talking, no humming, no asking for the salt. Not that they had much salt anyway. Instead, one monk read aloud from scripture while the others chewed in holy harmony. So not only were you eating in silence, but your internal monologue was being invaded by a reading of Job's suffering. Inspiring? Sure. Appetite-inducing? Not so much. The dining area itself, the refectory, was simple. Long wooden tables, benches, and a general air of monastic melancholy. Bowls were communal, utensils minimal. Hands often did the work, spoons couldn't. And once the bell rang for prayer again, whatever you didn't finish went back to the kitchen or to the pigs if it had dared to taste good. The spiritual goal of all this austerity was detachment. Detachment from luxury. Detachment from gluttony. Detachment from the kind of cinnamon roll you'll now be craving for the rest of this chapter. But while monks were voluntarily suffering for holiness, the meals they ate said one thing very clearly: this world is not your home, and neither is this breakfast. So could you handle it? Could you stare down a bowl of tepid lentils at sunrise and call it a blessing? Could you drink a cup of sadness ale without reaching for a seasoning packet and an emotional support snack? Because in the monastery, meals weren't a time to indulge, they were a time to reflect, and sometimes reflect on how good you had it before you renounced all worldly joy. So you think your desk job is rough? Try spending 12 hours a day hunched over a splintery wooden bench, squinting at Latin text in candlelight while holding a feather dipped in ink that stains everything but the parchment. Welcome to the life of a medieval scribe, where paper cuts were a way of life, posture was a myth, and carpal tunnel syndrome was just called Tuesday. Being a scribe in a medieval monastery wasn't just a chore, it was a calling, a spiritual discipline, and a form of high-stakes tedium. These poor souls were entrusted with the sacred task of copying holy texts, theological treatises, and occasionally herbal remedy guides that promised to cure everything from boils to demonic possession. And they had to do it perfectly. One mistake? You didn't just get a stern look from your superior, you risked eternal damnation for corrupting the word of God. No pressure, Brother Gregory. Let's start with the tools. Forget sleek keyboards or gel pens. Scribes used quills, feathers pulled from geese, trimmed and hardened to hold just enough ink to write for a few seconds before needing a dip. The ink itself was a cocktail of soot, gall nuts, and iron salts, basically a potion of tree sadness and metallurgy. If you spilled it on the page, you couldn't just crumple it up and start over. Parchment was made from animal skin, calf, sheep, or goat, and it was expensive. One book could require an entire flock's worth of hides. Mistakes were sometimes scraped off carefully with a knife, and sometimes just decorated around. Because, hey, divine forgiveness, right? Now imagine transcribing the Bible, not skimming it, not quoting a verse to look holy on social media, but writing it out, all of it, word by word, letter by letter. Every comma had to be in the right place, or rather every space, because punctuation was a bit of a free-for-all back then. And the handwriting? It had to be not just legible but beautiful. Monastic scribes often used elaborate scripts, Carolingian minuscule, Gothic black letter, and other names that sound like death metal bands. This was not a job for the sloppy or the easily distracted. A sneeze could destroy 3 hours of work. A flickering candle could char the page, and if you were lucky enough to have a mouse run across your desk, nibbling on the edge of the book you've been copying for 6 months, well, congratulations, You just received your first real test in Christian patience. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Occasionally, scribes let a little personality slip through. In the margins of these painstaking manuscripts, you'll find doodles. Yes, doodles of dragons fighting snails, bored monks tossing rude glances, or, inexplicably, rabbits jousting. These weren't accidents. They were quiet acts of rebellion, artistic flair, or perhaps signs of a slow descent into ink-stained madness. Even better were the curses they sometimes left for readers. Whoever steals this book, may he be ripped apart by swine and his soul cooked in eternal fire. You know, just a gentle reminder to return borrowed texts. And then there were the illuminated manuscripts, truly a labor of obsession. These were decorated with gold leaf, vibrant pigments made from crushed minerals, and detailed illustrations so intricate you'd swear they were done under a microscope. Illumination wasn't just for decoration, it elevated the book into an object of divine beauty. Unfortunately, it also meant even more hours bent over a page, painstakingly applying pigment with brushes made from squirrel hair. Some monks went blind from the work, others suffered chronic pain, and still, they persisted, because the work was holy, and because in a monastery, refusing a task meant more than losing your job. It meant breaking your vow of obedience, which, spiritually speaking, was worse than spilling the inkpot. The life of a scribe demanded endurance. Your day was divided not by coffee breaks, but by canonical hours. You wrote between prayers, meals, and more prayers. You couldn't chat. You couldn't complain. You just sat, wrote, and hoped your wrist didn't seize up before you finished Genesis. Still, some scribes became legends in their own right, creating works so detailed and stunning they're still studied centuries later. The Book of Kells, for example, wasn't just a manuscript. It was a magnum opus of devotion and dexterity. It practically radiates divine effort and likely severe back pain. So the next time you grumble about filling out a spreadsheet, remember the monks who inked scripture by hand, day after day in a room so quiet you could hear a feather drop, literally, and they did it all without eye drops or lumbar support. The good news, they got to read while they worked. The bad news, it was the same paragraph for 3 weeks straight. Let's talk cleanliness, or rather the glorious musky absence of it. If you're picturing monastic life as tranquil, candle-lit halls and the faint scent of lavender wafting through the cloisters, allow history to grab you by the nose and drag you into reality. Hygiene in the medieval monastery wasn't just minimal, it was practically outlawed by implication, in a place where physical suffering was seen as a fast track to spiritual enlightenment. Bathing regularly was suspicious, soap was rare, and anyone who smelled too fresh might as well have walked in waving a pitchfork and claiming to be Satan's perfumer. Now, to be fair, monks did have a concept of hygiene. It's just that it was filtered through a very specific lens, the spiritual. Physical cleanliness was nowhere near as important as moral purity. After all, if your soul was squeaky clean, who cared about the layer of crust forming behind your ears? In fact, many monks believed that enduring the stench of their own bodies and those of their brethren was a holy test of humility and endurance. Odor was a form of penance, like incense, but with more weeping. Take baths, for example. Monks didn't necessarily avoid them, they just didn't invite them. Depending on the order, you might be allowed to bathe 2 or 3 times per year, not per week, not per month, per year. And even then it wasn't a luxurious soak in lavender-scented water. It was more like a reluctant splash in something tepid, supervised by a brother who definitely wasn't enjoying the job either. Communal bathhouses did exist in some monasteries, particularly in the wealthier ones, but using them was often more about obedience than hygiene. You'd file in, endure a few minutes of being damp and judged, and then head back to your duties still vaguely sticky and resentful. Towels were optional. Dignity, gone with the steam. Toilets, oh yes, we have to go there, were another masterpiece of medieval compromise. Known as rereborters, communal latrines were typically built at the end of dormitory halls and positioned over a running stream which was supposed to carry away the waste. In practice, This meant that every bathroom break was a group activity, with little privacy and lots of unspoken eye contact. And yes, the stream system worked about as well as you're imagining. Sometimes nature called, and then got backed up for days. Toilet paper was unheard of. Instead, monks used things like straw, moss, or if you were particularly lucky, the soft corner of an old manuscript page, which is probably why scribes cursed their readers, come to think of it. Hand washing afterward? Technically encouraged, but not exactly enforced. Germ theory, after all, was still a distant twinkle in science's eye. Monks believed in miasma, the idea that bad smells carried disease, so while the latrine might reek to high heaven, the real concern wasn't bacteria, it was whether the air was offended. Even laundry was suspect. Clothes were often washed only when visibly soiled or infested with something that visibly moved, and in an era before detergents and convenient soap bars, washing might mean slapping a tunic against rocks and hoping the Holy Spirit took care of the rest. Some monks even wore their robes while bathing so they could clean both themselves and their clothing simultaneously. Two birds, one sad, soggy stone. Now here's where it gets truly medieval. Dirt was often seen as a virtue. The grubbier you were, the holier you appeared. In fact, stories abound of saints and ascetics, whose personal odors were described as either miraculous or impossible to ignore. Take St. Francis of Assisi, beloved, barefoot, and deeply unbothered by the smell of his own sanctity. There were entire orders that considered filth a badge of honor, something that showed disdain for worldly vanity. If your feet weren't caked in mud, and your robe didn't have mysterious stains from 4 meals ago, were you even trying to be spiritual? Monks didn't exactly enjoy this. Let's be clear, they just saw it as part of the path to discipline. A clean body, in their logic, could lead to pride, which led to sin, which led straight to the hot place. So better to stay humble and smell like a fermented turnip than risk the wrath of vanity. But that didn't mean they didn't notice the filth. Chronicles occasionally mention complaints about lice infestations in beds, fleas in cloaks, and skin infections that spread through whole monasteries like particularly judgmental plagues. Some even kept pet cats not for companionship but to control the rats, who were having their own little prayer meetings in the grain stores. So if you, modern reader, think you could breeze into a medieval monastery and get by with your artisanal deodorant and fancy microfoam soap, think again. You'd be sniffed out within minutes, possibly accused of sorcery, and sent to reflect on your sins in the nearest cesspit of righteousness. This wasn't just roughing it. This was holy grime, sacred stink, and the divine perfume of unwashed linen. In a medieval monastery, confession wasn't just a sacrament, it was practically a sport. While you might think bearing your soul once a year is enough to keep your spiritual credit score healthy, monks had a far more rigorous system. Here, every thought, hiccup, and vague craving had the potential to land you in a deeply introspective crisis. Forget lying or stealing. This was a world where simply enjoying the way a candle flickered during Vespers might prompt a spiral of guilt that required immediate spiritual triage. Daily confession was a standard practice for many monastic communities. It wasn't always formal, kneeling in a booth and whispering your sins to a cloaked figure behind a screen. More often, monks would confess to their superiors or spiritual advisors face to face. This wasn't a quick "bless me, Father" moment. It was often a thorough examination of conscience, where the tiniest infractions were scrutinized like crumbs on a cassock. And what counted as an infraction? Pretty much everything. Maybe you dozed off slightly during lauds, maybe you fantasized about roasted chicken during a fast, or heaven help you, you mentally composed a sarcastic haiku about Brother Gilbert's snoring. These were all potential soul smudgers. There's even historical evidence that monks confessed to breaking silence by coughing too loudly or feeling pride after writing a particularly well-formed cue. In fact, some orders went as far as practicing chapter of faults, a daily or weekly gathering where monks would openly accuse themselves, and occasionally each other, of minor misdeeds. Imagine a support group where instead of encouraging each other you announced to the room, "I confess I lingered too long near the herb garden and thought the thyme smelled pleasing." It wasn't unusual for monks to kneel in front of the group while their brothers nodded in solemn judgment, occasionally doling out penances that ranged from prayers to prostrations to dish duty. But this wasn't all just sadistic spiritual nitpicking. The underlying philosophy was that true holiness came not only from avoiding sin, but from cultivating constant self-awareness. Monks weren't expected to be perfect. They were expected to never stop trying. The rule of Saint Benedict encouraged monks to view every day as a spiritual training session, and every failure, no matter how microscopic, as an opportunity to grow. Basically, guilt was less about wallowing and more about getting swole in the soul department. Still, the mental gymnastics required to avoid pride, sloth, gluttony, envy, and all their wretched cousins could be exhausting. 1 minute, you're feeling satisfied with a productive morning of scribing. The next, you're panicking that your satisfaction itself was a sinful flirtation with vanity. The mental loop-de-loops were relentless. It's like living inside a moral escape room where the puzzles keep multiplying and the only clue is stop enjoying things. And of course, this wasn't private. Monks were part of tightly knit communities where transparency was the rule, not the exception. Your spiritual state was everybody's business. If you confessed to taking a few extra beans at supper, Brother Thomas might make a passive-aggressive comment during prayer the next morning, just to keep you humble. The monastery was less of a peaceful sanctuary and more of a medieval Big Brother house, minus the cameras, but plus a lot of guilt and incense. There were even monks who specialized in helping others navigate their moral minefields, spiritual directors or confessors who'd been around long enough to tell the difference between a fleeting temptation and a full-blown crisis of faith. These poor souls basically moonlighted as medieval therapists, listening to endless dronings of imagined sins with all the patience of a stone statue and about as much personal privacy. To top it all off, some monks kept spiritual journals, tiny handwritten diaries of their daily struggles, stray thoughts and internal rebukes. These documents, when they survive, are equal parts heart-wrenching and oddly charming. One might read, "Today I experienced improper joy at Brother Martin's misfortune when he spilled his ink. I felt pride that my own manuscript remained unblotted. I confessed at once. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. There was a strange sort of camaraderie and collective repentance. Monks knew each other's flaws intimately, not because they were judgmental, but because the whole system relied on mutual support and shared vulnerability. There was no room for ego because everyone was under the same microscope. You weren't competing for holiness. You were clinging to it together like raft mates on the spiritual Titanic. So yes, monastic guilt made Catholic guilt look like a gentle suggestion. You didn't just feel bad for the big stuff. You felt bad for wanting to feel good. It was a constant self-checking loop of intention, action and reaction, all wrapped in layers of robes and remorse. And if you think that sounds exhausting, you're absolutely right. Let's take a moment to imagine your daily to-do list in a medieval monastery. Wake up at 2 a.m. Tell your knees forget what cartilage is. Eat a cold chunk of barley-flavored disappointment. And then just when you think it's time for a nap, you get handed a hoe and pointed toward a field of stubborn, unforgiving dirt. Welcome to the agricultural portion of your holy suffering. Monks weren't just spiritual warriors, they were also full-time gardeners, part-time ploughmen, and amateur root enthusiasts. In fact, physical labor wasn't seen as a punishment or a side gig, it was a sacred duty. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, idleness is the enemy of the soul, and nothing crushes idleness or your lower back quite like hacking weeds out of monastery soil for hours on end. And this wasn't the kind of gardening you do on weekends to relax with a podcast and a latte. This was grueling, meditative, dirt under the fingernails, I think I saw God in a cabbage kind of work. Monks planted, weeded, harvested, and repeated, all with the solemn determination of men who knew their salvation depended on both spiritual reflection and seasonal crop rotation. The monastery's gardens weren't just there to produce food. They were carefully planned sanctuaries of discipline and devotion. Herbs like sage, thyme, and wormwood were tended with surgical care, not because monks had a thing for garnish, but because herbs were the closest thing they had to a pharmacy. Before the word doctor meant anything more than priest who's good at leeches, monks were the ones mixing potions and applying poultices. A monastery's herb garden was its emergency room, apothecary, and sometimes its snack bar. But don't get too excited. Your average monk's diet wasn't exactly a medieval tasting menu. In fact, calling it austere would be like calling the plague a bit of a cough. Meat was generally banned, unless you were on death's door, or miraculously assigned to the infirmary, where soup sometimes came with flavor. For the rest, meals were a symphony of grains, legumes, and you guessed it, turnips. Lots of turnips. The humble turnip was the unsung hero of monastic dining. Cheap, easy to grow, and capable of surviving neglect, frost, and spiritual malaise. Served boiled, mashed, or occasionally just glaring at you from your plate, the turnip was less a food and more a test of your resolve. If you could stare down another turnip stew without breaking into tears, congratulations, you were truly on the path to enlightenment. And let's not forget the sacred art of composting. While medieval monks didn't have modern waste management, they absolutely understood the cycle of life and decay. Nothing went to waste, not even the scraps from your joyless dinner. Peels, stalks, and rejected root vegetables were composted and returned to the earth, fertilizing the very soil that would grow next season's equally joyless vegetables. It was a system built on humility, sustainability, and the knowledge that your dinner next month would probably taste like your dinner last month, and the month before that. Farming wasn't just about growing food, though. It was a deeply spiritual act, working with the land-connected monks to the rhythms of God's creation. Every weed pulled was a metaphor for rooting out sin. Every ploughed row represented a new spiritual path, and every time a monk accidentally stepped in manure, it was a reminder that even the holiest among us must walk through some earthly mess to find divine meaning. Let's also talk tools. There were no gas-powered tillers or ergonomic gloves, just simple wooden spades, iron hose, and your increasingly blistered hands. If you were lucky, someone from the monastery's blacksmithing crew had managed to hammer together a rake that didn't disintegrate mid-pull. If you were unlucky, your tool of choice was older than half the psalms you'd memorized. And yet, despite the mud, the sweat, the blisters, and the sheer volume of turnips, the monks believed that tending to the land was a path to holiness. Manual labor was a form of worship. Every bead of sweat was a kind of prayer, and the silence of the fields, broken only by the occasional grunt or root-related curse muttered under one's breath, offered a different kind of stillness than the chapel. At the end of the day, you'd drag your aching body back to your cell, covered in dirt, reeking of herbs and compost, and wondering if enlightenment came with calluses. And just before your eyes fluttered shut, a bell would toll, reminding you it was time for evening prayers. Because apparently God isn't impressed by your turnip harvest unless you also sing about it. If you've ever been shushed in a modern library for coughing too enthusiastically, you haven't experienced true silence warfare until you've walked into a medieval monastic library. Picture this: a long stone hall, dimly lit by flickering candles, filled with robed figures hunched over massive tomes, eyes narrowed, quills twitching, and the collective tension of 1,000 unsaid words. Welcome to the monastic library, where a sneeze could get you side-eyed for a week, and a whispered bless you might spark an ecclesiastical investigation. Monasteries in the medieval world were more than just spiritual sanctuaries. They were the information superhighways of their day, albeit at the speed of one monk, one pen, and a dangerously cramped hand. These secluded enclaves, especially the Benedictine ones, doubled as universities, publishing houses, and Fort Knox-level vaults for books, while the rest of Europe occasionally dabbled in burning knowledge, thanks various inquisitions. Monks were quietly hoarding it, carefully copying, cataloguing, and preserving ancient texts, with a degree of obsession that would make your local librarian blush. The monastic library was considered sacred space, not just because it housed knowledge, but because that knowledge was often considered divine. The works of St. Augustine, Aristotle, and even some pagan Roman philosophers sat cheek to cheek on those creaky oak shelves, And unlike your average dusty college library, these books didn't just sit there waiting to be stolen, they were literally chained to the desks. Yes, chained. Heavy iron links ensured that no curious brother or visiting scholar could wander off with a volume under his robe. A Bible in the 12th century could cost as much as a house. So monks weren't taking any chances with book burglars. "Thou shalt not steal" applied doubly when illuminated manuscripts were involved. And while you may imagine these libraries as peaceful havens of reflection and learning, they were also places of grueling mental labor. Monks in the scriptorium, the designated writing room, often worked under strict silence, with only their thoughts, their inkpots, and the occasional stomach grumble to keep them company. Even clearing one's throat could cause a cascade of passive-aggressive glances. The silence wasn't just about avoiding distraction, it was a spiritual practice. Writing holy texts was seen as an act of devotion, and the less you let your ego or your voice interfere, the purer the work. This strict silence, however, did not prevent drama. Marginalia, those little notes scribbled in the corners or margins of manuscripts, are where monks let loose. You'll find everything from sassy complaints, "This parchment is hairy," to mini rants, "I am very cold," "This ink is terrible," or my personal favorite, "Now I've written the whole thing, for Christ's sake, give me a drink." While they couldn't speak aloud, their pens whispered centuries of quiet rebellion. But the library wasn't just about copying books, it was also a place of study. Monks spent hours memorizing passages, debating theological nuances, and mentally jousting with the likes of Boethius and Bede. Without the distractions of YouTube, cat memes, or even newspapers, the mind turned inward and upward. Knowledge was not just for utility, but for salvation. The more one knew of Scripture, the more equipped one was to battle temptation, heresy, or a particularly difficult passage of Latin. And let's not forget the architecture. Monastic libraries were designed not only for function, but also for inspiration. Tall ceilings, stained glass, and intricate woodwork turned these rooms into cathedrals of cognition. The beauty was intentional, a reminder that learning was sacred and that a well-crafted sentence was as divine as a hymn. Still, it wasn't all solemn scholarship. Over time, some monasteries began expanding their libraries beyond strictly religious texts. You could find medical treatises, histories of foreign lands, and the occasional bestiary filled with wild illustrations of animals that looked like nightmares and guesses. These texts provided monks with windows into the broader world, a world they had mostly renounced in favor of prayer and peace, but couldn't quite stop being curious about. Of course, accessing the library wasn't as simple as flashing your monastic ID and wandering in. Rules were strict. Books were assigned based on rank, purpose, and theological maturity. You didn't just check out a volume of Origen's theological commentaries if you were a novice who still struggled to pronounce Trinitarian, and everything had to be returned on time, unless you wanted to risk penance or public shaming at dinner. So the next time you're feeling scholarly while sipping a latte in a cozy reading nook, spare a thought for the monks who copied entire Bibles by candlelight, in a silence so absolute it could be cut with a butter knife if butter knives had been invented. Their painstaking efforts preserved the knowledge that helped pull Europe out of the Dark Ages, one chained book at a time. Welcome to the end of the monastic road. There's no after-party, no beach vacation, no golden years sipping wine in Tuscany. Just you, your prayer mat, your aching joints, and the slow spiritual crawl towards sainthood, or more realistically, quietly keeling over in the middle of evening prayers, while Brother Gerald continues chanting because he thinks you're just being extra devout. Monastic life wasn't a temporary phase. It was a full-time, lifelong commitment, like a marriage, except with significantly less cuddling and significantly more Latin. Once you were in, that was it. You didn't take breaks. You didn't check out for the weekend. You didn't find yourself backpacking through Gaul. You were already found, and the answer was chanting, fasting, and growing vegetables until the Lord called you home. Free time? That's a pagan myth. Monastic schedules were crafted with all the flexibility of a concrete slab. Every moment of your day was spoken for, by bells, by rules, by the rule of Saint Benedict. who clearly didn't believe in sleeping in or impromptu picnics. Prayer wasn't just a morning or evening thing. It was an hourly affair. Lauds, prime terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Each one a spiritual appointment you couldn't skip unless you were dead. And even then someone would still expect you to show up in spirit. There were no hobbies. You didn't knit scarves or carve ducks unless it somehow glorified God. You didn't doodle unless it was in the margins of a psalter and featured a theological snail fighting a knight. You didn't take up woodworking for fun. You did it because the abbey needed shelves, and also because self-denial is easier when you're holding a chisel. And absolutely no dating. You were married to the Lord now, which, romantic as it sounds, comes with 0 candlelit dinners and a whole lot of celibacy. Monks weren't just celibate, they were professionally celibate. You could practically hear their libido whimper and pack its bags during the vows. Relationships were strictly spiritual, and by spiritual we mean conducted with maximum physical distance and preferably through a stone wall. Even illness didn't give you a break. Got the plague? That's unfortunate. You'll be praying through it. Lost the use of your hand from excessive manuscript copying? Offer it up to God. You were expected to embrace suffering like a warm, scratchy woolen blanket woven from divine discipline. Pain was considered a gift, a way to purify the soul and really lean into that whole miserable but holy lifestyle. Headache, spiritual growth, back pain, inner fortitude, unexplained rash, probably a test from God or the communal latrine, hard to say. This wasn't some sadistic system dreamed up by power-hungry clerics either. Many monks genuinely believed that mortifying the flesh brought them closer to divine truth. To modern ears, that sounds like a wellness retreat designed by your least favorite medieval gym coach. But to them, discipline was the path to salvation. The less you indulged, the more you ascended, which is noble, yes, but also explains why no monk ever wrote, "Treat yourself." As for retirement, well, that's a laugh. You didn't age out of monkhood. There was no peaceful cottage to retire to, no pension to collect, and certainly no pipe smoking by the fireplace while reminiscing about your wild youth in the scriptorium. You simply got older, moved a little slower, and sat closer to the fire during winter readings. When you finally did shuffle off this mortal coil, it wasn't with fanfare. Often, it was mid-prayer, mid-fast, or mid-hoe in the vegetable garden. And sometimes no one noticed right away because everyone was too busy praying to acknowledge that Brother Stephen had been in the same kneeling position for 6 hours and had begun to smell a bit suspicious. Despite the brutal simplicity of it all, some monks found real joy in the monotony. Not the kind of joy that makes you laugh or dance, but the kind that comes from complete surrender. There was peace in predictability, purpose in sacrifice, and deep meaning in every aching step toward heaven. In a world full of chaos, war, and disease, the monastery was an island of grim, quiet, grueling stability. But let's be clear, if you're the kind of person who gets twitchy after 2 hours without Wi-Fi, you wouldn't have lasted a day. Close your eyes and imagine someone telling you, "Hey, let's build a city on a swamp." Now imagine that person not being laughed out of the room, but being given a boatload of wood and told, "Great idea, start tomorrow." That's essentially how Venice began. In the 5th and 6th centuries, as waves of barbarians trampled through the Italian mainland like toddlers in a toy store, desperate Roman refugees looked toward the marshy, mosquito-infested Venetian lagoon and said, "Sure, why not?" What they lacked in common sense, they made up for in stubbornness. The early Venetians didn't so much conquer the land as negotiate with mud. The Venetian lagoon isn't exactly prime real estate. It's shallow, silty, and has the structural integrity of soggy toast. But necessity breeds innovation, or in this case, maritime madness. To make the city work, the Venetians had to build the land before they could build on the land. So they drove thousands, literally thousands, of wooden stakes into the mud, forming artificial platforms on which they constructed buildings. These logs, mostly made from water-resistant alder wood, were sunk deep into the muck and topped with layers of stone. Over time, the wood petrified in the oxygen-starved mud, turning into a sort of underground fossilized forest, holding up cathedrals, mansions, and marketplaces. It was like building Jenga towers on a sponge. Now, if you think that sounds stable, spoiler alert, it's not. Venice has been sinking since before it was finished. Between the weight of its own fabulous architecture and the slow squish of sedimentary regret, parts of the city sink about 1-2 millimeters per year. Doesn't sound like much, but add a few centuries and suddenly your kitchen's underwater and your dining room has become a gondola parking spot. Of course, Venice didn't just sink quietly, it liked to flood dramatically. Flooding, known locally as acqua alta, high water, was a seasonal event like Christmas but wetter and with fewer gifts. During acqua alta, the city transforms into a surreal maze of flooded plazas, ankle-deep cafes and pedestrians in knee-high boots that say, "I planned for this, but I regret everything." In the Middle Ages, these floods were less charming and more catastrophic. Imagine trying to sell turnips at the market while your stall floats down a canal like a soggy parade float. You might think the residents were constantly panicking about their city slowly becoming Atlantis, but no, they just got very good at pretending everything was fine. Denial wasn't just a psychological defense mechanism, it was a civic virtue. If the piazza was flooded, just roll out some wooden planks and keep shopping. If the ground floor of your house filled with water, turn it into an indoor aquarium and move upstairs. Venice was the medieval capital of "it is what it is." And yet, despite being a soggy architectural dare, Venice worked, not just functioned, but thrived. Against all odds, the city grew into a bustling, wealthy, and frankly outrageous maritime empire. By the 13th century, it was one of the richest cities in Europe. And all this, on 1,118 little islands connected by bridges that range from quaint to "is this even structurally legal?" The geography of Venice shaped every part of its society. It wasn't a city with canals, it was canals with a city barely holding itself together above them. Streets were narrow because boats took priority. There was no room for horses or wagons, which meant no manure, but also meant everything had to be hauled by hand or floated in. Moving house wasn't calling a truck, it was calling your cousin's boat and hoping it didn't capsize your mattress. Even the city's layout was a cartographer's nightmare. Streets didn't follow grids, they followed whimsy. Addresses were vague, maps were more like wishful thinking. Finding someone's house was less about directions and more about divine intervention. Locals gave directions like, "Turn right at the second bridge after the square with the man who smells like fish," and hoped for the best. And yet, Venice endured. It prospered in a way that defied logic, physics, and dry socks, the very thing that should have made it a forgotten backwater. The geography became its secret weapon. The lagoon protected it from invaders, allowed it to control maritime trade routes, and gave it a unique identity. Other cities had walls. Venice had water. But make no mistake, living in medieval Venice was not some dreamy gondola ride. It was a damp, creaky, off-kilter experience, where your home slowly shifted under your feet and the streets tried to drown you twice a year. It was a place where ambition outpaced stability, and somehow the citizens made it all work with a shrug, a smirk, and a fresh pair of boots. So if you think you could have handled medieval Venice, just remember, the sidewalks sank, the water stank, and your front door occasionally turned into a waterfall, and that was just Monday. Imagine waking up in the morning, stepping out your front door, and nearly falling into a canal. Welcome to medieval Venice, where the streets weren't streets in the normal sense. They were canals, alleyways the width of a sneeze, and bridges designed by people who hated symmetry and loved chaos. The first thing a visitor noticed was the absence of something: horses. In most medieval cities you'd find hooves clopping, carts creaking, and manure politely reminding you where you were. Not in Venice. Horses were useless here. Wheels were downright insulting. Why own a cart when your neighborhood was one heavy rain away from floating out to sea? Instead, Venice relied on its watery labyrinth. The canals, more than 150 of them, weren't scenic novelties. They were the main roads. Gondolas, barges, and a collection of suspiciously unstable skiffs acted as the medieval equivalent of taxis, buses, and moving vans. These weren't joyrides serenaded by accordion players in striped shirts. They were daily commutes, and they were rough. The gondola, as we know it today, sleek, elegant, and perfect for overpriced romantic selfies, was still evolving in the Middle Ages. Back then, boats were flatter, clunkier, and much more about function than flair. They were loaded with goods, people, livestock, barrels, crates, probably someone's mother-in-law, and they were steered by people who, quite frankly, sometimes looked like they learned boating from reading soup recipes. Accidents were inevitable. Boats collided, people fell in. Entire market stalls were lost to rogue waves from an over-enthusiastic delivery barge. If you were lucky, you'd only get splashed. If you were unlucky, you'd be wading in a liquid mystery composed of water, fish parts, and everything the street didn't want anymore. And if you thought walking was better, surprise, Venice said, "Here, have some charming stone alleys that are always wet, usually mossy and barely wide enough for a sober person to pass. And heaven help you if you tried navigating them after a few goblets of Venetian wine." Many a nobleman went out to meet his mistress, and instead ended up making out with a cold canal. Bridges were the only thing standing between the pedestrian and total aquatic defeat. By the 14th century, Venice had hundreds of them, each with its own unique way of making you question your life choices. Some were arched so high they felt like stairways to heaven, especially if you were hauling baskets of squid. Others were so flat and narrow that crossing them was like walking a tightrope in the fog, and there were no handrails in the early days. None. Just slippery stone, blind corners, and the occasional flock of gossiping old ladies who would absolutely not move to let you pass. And forget about wheelbarrows or wagons. You were the wheelbarrow. Everything you owned, bought, or sold had to be carried on your back or floated across the water. Moving day in Venice was less load the cart and more hope you don't drop grandma into the Grand Canal. Even the postman, if you can call him that, had a bad time. Letters and messages had to be hand-delivered, often by boatmen, porters, or small boys with surprisingly nimble sea legs. Delivering mail wasn't a simple walk through the neighborhood. It was a nautical obstacle course featuring bridges, tides, and occasionally aggressive geese. Let's also talk about the things floating in the water. Oh yes, the canals weren't pristine. They weren't even moderately gross. They were a medieval broth of fish guts, garbage, and occasional unidentifiable ex-possessions. Since Venice didn't have a sewer system that you'd call sanitary, waste went straight into the canals. Yes, that kind of waste. Buckets were dumped. Toilets, if you had one, flushed into the nearest lagoon. If you fell in, no matter your social status, your dignity stayed behind. So how did people not fall in all the time? Oh, they did, constantly. The city even had official water rescue roles. If you fell into a canal, someone might fish you out or laugh, or both. Getting drenched was a common enough event that falling in became a sort of slapstick rite of passage. Bonus points if you were holding groceries. Strangely, Venetians didn't seem to mind. They adapted. Children learned to swim as soon as they could walk, or they didn't walk far. Men wore short cloaks and carried waterproof boots. Women held their skirts high above the puddles. And everyone developed a sixth sense for bridge etiquette. Tourists, yes, Venice had them even then, stood out immediately. They were the ones clinging to walls and yelping at gondola wakes. Transportation wasn't just about moving. It was about surviving the commute with dry feet and your lunch intact. Whether by boat or by boot, every journey in Venice was a lesson in humility, balance, and how to curse poetically when you slipped on eel slime. And yet, somehow the system worked. Goods arrived. People traveled. Gossip floated, both literally and figuratively, and the city kept humming along atop its damp foundations. The Venetians didn't just live with their strange street system, they leaned into it. They turned watery inconvenience into daily routine, and slipperiness into strategy. So if you think you could handle a day in medieval Venice, ask yourself this: can you swim, balance a sack of onions, and duck under a bridge while a barge full of goats barrels toward you? No? Then bring a towel. You're going in. Let's get one thing out of the way. Medieval Venice did not smell like a romantic gondola ride and fresh espresso. It smelled like a fisherman's laundry basket, left out in the sun, dunked in a sewer, and then generously seasoned with mystery fluids. The city may have been dazzling to the eyes, but to the nose, it was a full-on olfactory assault. The smell of Venice wasn't just bad, it was legendary. It had range, it had layers. It could politely waft from a distance or punch you square in the nostrils as soon as you turned a corner. And unlike most medieval cities, where at least the smell could occasionally drift away, Venice was surrounded by water that politely trapped every odor like a very soggy, very determined cheesecloth. Let's start with the basics. No plumbing. The medieval Venetian concept of waste disposal was basically out of sight, out of mind. Except in this case, out of sight meant into the canal directly below your window. Buckets were the chosen tool of the trade. Chamber pots were emptied with dramatic flair. Latrines were often built directly over the water, transforming the beautiful lagoon into a medieval soup that no one ever ordered. And this was not clean water. Oh no, the canals were tidal, but the tide wasn't some magical flushing mechanism. The water would go out and then come back in, bringing with it everything it picked up along the way, including things you absolutely positively did not want to be reacquainted with. Then there were the fish markets. Venice was a city of traders, yes, but it was also a city of fish. So much fish. Sardines, anchovies, eels, bream, shellfish. You name it, they caught it, sold it, and left the leftover parts to slowly decompose in corners no one bothered to clean. The Rialto market, now a tourist spot, was once a fishy battlefield of flapping tails, discarded guts, and vendors yelling over each other like they were auditioning for an opera no one wanted to attend. Add to this the smell of plague pits. That's right, during the many plague outbreaks, Venice seemed to collect them like rare coins. Bodies piled up faster than the city could bury them. While some were carted off to the Lazaretto islands outside the city, others lingered, or were buried in hastily dug, poorly covered mass graves. A hot, humid summer's day in plague-era Venice was less breezy and beautiful, and more, God has abandoned us. And don't forget the people. This was an era before deodorant, regular bathing, or personal shame. Soap was a luxury. Showers were not a thing. A full bath was often reserved for the sick, the rich, or the recently exercised. Most Venetians just did a quick splash of water, also from the canals, you see the problem, and hoped for the best. Combine that with heavy layered clothing, and you had a society that smelled like ambition marinated in armpit. So how did people survive this? Perfume, not the subtle floral notes we use today. Venetian perfume was a full-on defensive weapon. People doused themselves in mixtures of rosewater, ambergris, and whatever else smelled better than reality, which was, frankly, anything. Nobles carried scented handkerchiefs and clutched them to their faces like they were fainting every 6 seconds. Merchants would burn incense in their shops. Even the church got in on the action. Priests swung those thuribles of incense, not just for holiness, but to avoid passing out mid-sermon. Some doctors wore long beak-like masks stuffed with herbs and spices, part superstition, part self-preservation, and all nightmare fuel. These masks weren't just creepy, they were practical. When your patients were dying, bleeding, and leaking various unpleasant fluids, smelling cinnamon through a bird snout was preferable to anything else. To make matters worse, yes, it gets worse, Venice was humid. Not, oh, I'm glistening humid. No, my shoes have turned into a swamp and my shirt smells like seaweed casserole humid. That mugginess clung to every scent, making them stick around like bad roommates. Odors didn't just visit, they moved in, and yet no one seemed to leave. The smell, horrific as it was, became background noise, a fact of life, like taxes or sudden political betrayal. Venetians simply accepted it. They sniffed, gagged, adapted. After all, where else could you make your fortune selling nutmeg, commission a chapel made entirely of marble, and get pickpocketed by someone in a velvet mask, all in the same morning? Still, for the uninitiated, visiting Venice was a trial by stench. Pilgrims arrived with dreams of beauty and left with haunted nostrils. Ambassadors composed long letters home that began with the political situation and quickly detoured into the scent situation. Even pets hesitated before drinking canal water. That tells you everything. So if you ever imagine yourself transported to medieval Venice, skipping merrily through the piazza with a gelato in hand, stop. Instead, imagine yourself holding your breath, navigating a citywide scratch-and-sniff disaster, and wondering how perfume became your only defense against existential despair. Because in Venice, the true silent killer wasn't poison or daggers, it was the air. If you were strolling through medieval Venice expecting simple tunics and sensible shoes, you were in for a visual ambush. The city wasn't just a marketplace of spices and silks, it was a runway show on the verge of collapse. Fashion in Venice didn't whisper wealth, it screamed it, in 50 shades of imported brocade and 2-story platform heels. Here, clothing was less about function and more about theatrical survival. The aristocracy took dress to impress to alarming new heights, literally. Let's talk about chopines, those infamous platform shoes that looked like stilts crossed with torture devices. Originally designed to keep women's dresses out of the mud, which was a generous assumption considering Venice's mud-to-solid ratio. These shoes eventually grew so tall, sometimes over 20 inches, that women needed servants just to walk, slowly, wobbling, like drunken flamingos in a parade of silk. Falling in love was one thing, falling off your shoes was another. Death by fashion wasn't metaphorical in Venice, it was a documented risk. A poorly placed cobblestone, a distracted pigeon, and suddenly you were less lady of leisure and more fashionable roadkill. Then there were the fabrics themselves. Venice was the silk capital of Europe, and it showed. If it shimmered, sparkled, or swooshed dramatically in the breeze, someone in Venice was wearing it, possibly in 17 layers and definitely in July. Velvet, damask, brocade, satin textiles, so luxurious they made entire wardrobes weigh more than the people wearing them. And we're not talking about clothes made for walking. These were garments engineered for being seen, slowly, regally, while moving approximately 5 steps per hour, because any faster and your hemline might catch fire from sheer friction. Wealthy Venetians wore robes so long they trailed behind like bridal trains, embroidered with gold thread and family crests, because nothing says humility like accidentally vacuuming the floor with your outfit. But while the rich paraded around in clothing worth more than most houses, the poor had a different fashion philosophy. Whatever keeps the wind out, peasants wore coarse wool, linens patched within an inch of their lives, and hand-me-downs so old they probably remembered the Fourth Crusade, while noble women debated which imported dye matched their chalice collection. Working women were busy tying rags around their feet and praying for dry weather. To keep this sartorial chaos from spiraling even further out of control, the Venetian government introduced sumptuary laws, basically medieval fashion police with a scroll. These laws dictated who could wear what, how much of it they could wear, and when they were allowed to flaunt it. In theory, sumptuary laws were meant to maintain moral order and prevent society from descending into fabric-based madness. In reality, they were ignored with the same enthusiasm people today have for speed limits. For example, the laws might say a nobleman couldn't wear more than a certain amount of velvet unless it was Tuesday, and unless his uncle had recently died, in which case full mourning sparkle was permitted. Women were prohibited from wearing gold thread unless they were married, unless they were rich enough to pay the fine, or unless they simply didn't care. The fines were rarely enforced, and if they were, the wealthy just paid them like subscription fees to a lifestyle of excessive drapery. Tailors became the real power brokers, able to craft legal loopholes into the sleeves of your gown. Oh no, signor, this isn't velvet, it's velvet adjacent. But Venice didn't just import fashion, it exported it too. Venetian lace was so sought after that it became a full-blown diplomatic gift. Entire convents were turned into lace workshops, where women worked themselves cross-eyed weaving intricate patterns that would be shipped across Europe to adorn queens, popes, and nobility, with necklines so sharp they could cut glass. Men weren't spared from the fashion arms race either. High collars, padded shoulders, enormous codpieces, yes, that's exactly what you think it is, and enough accessories to sink a fishing boat, were all fair game. The more impractical, the better. A true Venetian noble didn't wear a coat unless it made you question the structural stability of their upper torso. And of course the jewelry. Earrings big enough to double as dinner plates. Rings on every finger, sometimes 2 or 3 stacked, just in case you needed to blind someone with a handshake. Brooches shaped like mythological beasts. Hairpins that were basically weapons. If it glittered, it got pinned, fastened, or awkwardly sewn into a hat. It was all a performance. Venice had no royal court, no central palace of absolute power, so the rich had to outdress each other instead. Status was broadcast not with land titles, but with how many ostrich feathers you could balance on your head without toppling into a canal. It was like a fashion Cold War. No bloodshed, just beadwork. So, could you survive Venetian fashion? Could you layer 10 pounds of silk, balance on stilts, dodge sumptuary violations, and still look smug at a masked ball? If not, don't worry. At least you'll look fabulous as you fall face first into the lagoon. Welcome to Venice, where the local government made Orwellian nightmares look like amateur hour. You see, while most medieval cities worried about things like walls and water supply, Venice had its priorities straight: masks, surveillance, and shadowy power. If you've ever wondered what it's like to live inside a conspiracy theory, Venice was doing it live centuries before Reddit ever got a chance. At the center of the political circus was the Council of Ten, a group so powerful and so secretive that it makes your average Bond villain look like a community librarian. Officially, they were supposed to maintain state security. Unofficially, they were the duct tape holding together a republic held aloft by paranoia, bribery, and the occasional waterlogged corpse. Created in 1310 to suppress a rebellion, the Council of Ten was supposed to be temporary, but much like your cousin's couch-surfing habit, it just never left. These 10 men, plus a few advisors and the Doge when it suited them, operated with frightening autonomy. Want someone arrested? Done. Need someone disappeared? Also done. Evidence? That was optional. Due process? Adorable. If you were lucky, you got a trial. If you were really lucky, you got to survive it. And how did the council gather their intel? Venice had invented the world's moistest suggestion box. Throughout the city, particularly at the Doge's palace, were stone lion heads with open mouths, bocce di leone, where anyone could drop off an anonymous accusation. Anything from "my neighbor's cheating the salt tax" to "I think Marco is plotting a coup with the fishmongers" could land someone in hot water. Literally, torture was both an investigative tool and a conversational icebreaker. Imagine living in a place where every shadow could be watching you, and every friend could be a snitch. But it's Venice, so naturally fabulous snitches. That's where the masks come in. You've probably seen those long-nosed, gold-etched Venetian masks in souvenir shops. They look festive, mysterious, even elegant. Now imagine them not at a ball, but on a man tailing you through an alley at midnight. That's Venice. Masks weren't just for the carnival. Oh no, these things were daily wear for the stylishly paranoid. Want to attend a secret meeting? Wear a mask. Want to cheat on your spouse? Wear a mask. Want to accuse your brother-in-law of plotting sedition with a goat? Definitely wear a mask. One popular mask was the borta, a white ghost-like face covering with a prominent nose and no mouth opening. You could speak without being identified, eat without removing it, and walk straight into trouble without anyone knowing who you were. It was like a medieval VPN, but somehow creepier. There were even laws allowing people to enter government buildings while masked, because nothing says transparent democracy like anonymous men filing into secret courts. Even the Doge, Venice's elected leader for life, wasn't safe from the Council of Ten's web. His movements were restricted, his family couldn't intermarry with foreign nobles, and his diaries were inspected. Venice had perfected the art of keeping its own ruler in a decorative cage. Think of it like being crowned prom king, only to find out your limo is bugged and your corsage is watching you. And the secrets didn't stop at politics. Scandals of every flavor were hidden under a cloak, or more accurately, a mask. Affairs, betrayals, rivalries, and outright bribery operated beneath the surface of this watery city, all cloaked in plausible deniability and odd fish market. If you did get caught whispering treasonous sweet nothings, the Doge's palace had a little side hustle in correctional architecture, the piombi, or the leads. These were prison cells located directly under the lead-tiled roof, ensuring you'd experience the twin joys of imprisonment and slow-roasted brain syndrome during Venice's warm seasons. There was also the posy-damp, claustrophobic stone wells in the palace basement, where sunlight and hope went to die. But the most terrifying part? The system worked, at least for a few centuries. Venice kept her citizens in a delicate ballet of fear and splendor, where everyone knew their place, and masks protected your identity more effectively than the modern internet. The Council of Ten crushed multiple plots, quashed rebellions, and kept foreign influence at bay through sheer theatrical control. And despite it all, despite the constant dread that your neighbor might sell you out for wearing the wrong-colored hat, you couldn't help but admire the drama. This was a city where politics wasn't just policy, it was performance art. Surveillance wasn't digital, it was decorative, and the most dangerous thing you could wear wasn't a sword, it was a well-timed grin behind a mask. So yes, Venice was beautiful, but behind that postcard-perfect facade was a government so secretive it made the Illuminati look like a book club. And if you think you could handle living under such a regime, remember this: in Venice, the walls had ears, the lions had mouths, and the masks, well, the masks never smiled. If you wanted to get fabulously rich in the Middle Ages, you had two options: be born with a crown, or head to Venice and sell your soul to the highest bidder, preferably in bulk. By the 13th century, Venice was less a city and more an international shopping mall, with better architecture and slightly more backstabbing. It was where gold glittered, ships groaned under cargo, and the line between trade agreement and light piracy was charmingly blurry. Let's start with location. Venice wasn't just floating. It was strategically bobbing at the crossroads between Europe and the East, and the Venetians knew it. If trade routes were arteries, Venice was the overly smug heart pumping luxury goods, spices, silk, glass, and everything in between. The Mediterranean was their playground, and they played dirty with style. At the center of this gleaming enterprise stood the merchant class, a group of men who dressed like aristocrats, counted like bankers, and schemed like Bond villains. Venice was technically a republic, which in practice meant the Doge, their version of a president-king hybrid, was elected, but only by a very select group of very wealthy men who happened to control the economy, the courts, and probably your rent. Democracy, Venetian style. The real power didn't lie in swords or titles, it lay in ledgers. A successful merchant could climb the ranks of Venetian society faster than a gondolier spotting a tipper. Families like the Dolphin, Mocenigo, and Contarini weren't just noble by name, they were noble by sheer financial inertia. Nobility in Venice wasn't about blue blood, it was about blue-chip investments. Venetians had one motto: if you can buy it, ship it. If you can't buy it, marry into it or steal it creatively. Their trade network stretched from Alexandria to Antwerp, from Constantinople to Catalonia. Spices were a big deal. Literally, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg weren't just for flavor. They were currency, status symbols, and portable wealth, all in one aromatic package. Having a kitchen that smelled like a spice rack meant you were either wealthy or recently looted something. And speaking of looting, let's talk about the Fourth Crusade, or as Venice might have called it. That time we crusaded all the way to Constantinople and accidentally helped ourselves. Officially, it was a religious military expedition. Unofficially, it was one of the most profitable shopping sprees in history. When the knights couldn't pay Venice for transport, the Venetians suggested a little detour to a rebellious Christian city called Zara. One conquered Christian city led to another, and before long they were sacking Constantinople, the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire. Venice walked away with piles of gold, priceless relics, and a smug glow that can still be felt radiating from the horses outside St. Mark's Basilica. If your church decorations include stolen Byzantine statues, you're probably not on the moral high ground. But the Venetians weren't just opportunists. They were economic engineers. They created one of the first versions of a stock exchange where investors could buy into shipping ventures. You'd pool your money into a voyage, and if the ship didn't sink or get hijacked by pirates or Genoese rivals, you'd rake in some handsome profits. If it did sink, well, that's what insurance was for. Yes, Venice also helped invent marine insurance, because nothing says medieval innovation like profiting off someone else's misfortune at sea. Deals with the Muslim world were a particularly Venetian specialty. While the rest of Christendom wrung its hands about infidels and holy wars, Venice was busy making trade treaties with Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Silk, spices, exotic animals for eccentric nobles. The Venetians said yes to everything and frowned only at embargoes that cut into their profits. If you needed proof that gold transcends religion, Venice was it. But this wasn't just about material gain, it was about dominance. Venice managed its colonies like a corporate empire. Crete, Cyprus, and various ports along the Dalmatian coast were absorbed not for moral or military reasons, but because someone ran the numbers and it made sense on a spreadsheet. Local populations were often managed with a blend of administrative pressure, architectural flair, and the occasional bout of cultural steamrolling. Even the language of trade was tailored to efficiency. Venetian merchant manuals were written in a heady mix of Italian, Greek, and Arabic scribbles, and contracts came with clauses that would make modern lawyers sweat. Everything was documented, cross-referenced, and likely notarized by someone in very expensive shoes. And if a rival got in the way, Venice didn't go to war. Venice outbid them, outmaneuvered them, or quietly set their economy on fire. Genoa tried competing, Pisa tried competing, both eventually regretted trying. So yes, Venice was beautiful, but beneath the domes, mosaics and tourist trap gondolas was an engine of economic ruthlessness. The city floated on water, but it thrived on profit, patience, and perfectly timed betrayals. Because in Venice, morality was optional, but profit was mandatory. In the great European contest of who brought the plague home this time, Venice was something of an overachiever, thanks to its bustling trade routes, cozy ties with the East, and a city layout that practically begged for disease to move in and redecorate. Venice didn't just catch the plague, it gave it a prime canal-side apartment. Let's be clear, Venice was the medieval hotspot, and by hotspot we mean feverish, delirious, and very, very contagious, with merchant ships constantly arriving from far-off ports like Alexandria, Constantinople, and places whose names were suspiciously hard to pronounce. Venice was a luxury showroom for exotic goods and uninvited pathogens. Now, back in the 14th century, germ theory hadn't RSVP'd to the science party yet. People didn't understand bacteria or viruses. What they did understand was, if Marco leaves with a full crew and comes back with half of them vomiting blood and ringing church bells for last rites, something's off. And thus Venice had a eureka moment, followed by a lot of screaming and some deeply uncomfortable coughing. So what did they do? They invented the Lazaretto, not to be confused with the modern Jack White album. Venice was the first city to create a quarantine island, Lazaretto Vecchio, in 1423. If your ship pulled into port looking suspiciously sweaty, sneezy, or covered in boils, you were whisked away to this island like a contestant on the worst reality show ever, so you think you're contagious. These islands weren't five-star hotels, they were more like five-plague hovels. Incoming sailors and passengers would spend 40 days there, which is where the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni, comes from. 40 days of coughing, praying, and hoping your roommate wasn't a walking petri dish. The idea was simple. If you survived the month and a bit, you could enter Venice. If not, well, you helped reduce the city's infection rate and gave the lagoon some organic nutrients. The quarantine effort was surprisingly advanced for the time. Inspectors called health magistrates were appointed to check the incoming ships, record symptoms, and decide who got the deluxe isolation experience. Sometimes the inspectors wore long, beaked plague masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs. And let's be honest, if someone approaches you wearing a bird's beak full of lavender and they're not about to perform interpretive dance, something's gone very wrong with your healthcare system. These masks, paired with waxed robes and gloves, made the plague doctors look like confused crows attending a goth masquerade ball. But the fashion wasn't for flair. It was an early form of PPE. The beaks were meant to filter out bad air, which people believed carried the plague. Not entirely correct, but they were trying. Venetian death rituals added another layer of eerie beauty to the whole mess. Victims were often collected in the night, taken from homes via gondolas repurposed into silent funeral boats. No fanfare, no procession, just a hooded figure ferrying the dead beneath moonlit bridges. Romantic? Only if you're into gothic horror. And when things really got out of hand, as in piles of bodies by the canal levels of out of hand, Venice resorted to desperate measures. Mass graves were dug, bell ringers announced the hour of death with chilling regularity, and priests were given more overtime than anyone else in town. It wasn't uncommon for a single gondola to carry multiple bodies wrapped in linen, stacked like particularly morbid loaves of bread. Still, the Lazaretto system worked. Other cities noticed Venice wasn't collapsing as frequently, and took notes. Soon quarantine islands popped up all over Europe. Venice may have been drowning in trade goods, luxury fabrics and powdered wigs, but in this case it was also floating on innovation. And while you might imagine Venice as a sun-drenched dream of bridges and gondoliers serenading starry-eyed tourists, the truth was often darker, much darker. Behind every gilded mask and perfume-drenched noble, there was the quiet, creeping fear of the next outbreak. And just offshore, a little island waited to determine if you were bringing back cinnamon or death. Because in Venice, your passport wasn't enough. You also needed a clean bill of health, a strong stomach, and preferably no rats. Venice didn't just create the Renaissance, it created the world's first social distancing policy. 6 feet apart, try 6 miles of lagoon and a boat ride away. Venice might look like a serene watercolor postcard dipped in candlelight and cloaked in reverence. But don't be fooled. The city's religious life was a chaotic ballet danced on stilts. Literally, imagine building your cathedrals not on solid ground, but on damp marshland and hope, while your spiritual economy revolved around smug relic smuggling and theological turf wars. Yes, welcome to sacred Venice, where your eternal soul was on the line, and so was the structural integrity of your basilica. The first thing to understand is that every church in Venice, yes, all 100 plus of them, was essentially constructed on what amounts to soggy bread dough. Since the city was built on a swampy lagoon, foundations weren't so much laid as politely begged to stay upright. Builders drove thousands of wooden piles into the muddy ground, praying that the petrified forest they were creating would eventually become the base of something grand, spiritual, and preferably not underwater. Miraculously, it worked. St. Mark's Basilica, perched on timber stilts, the majestic Santa Maria della Salute, also playing a dangerous game of sink or serve. In Venice, attending Mass was a pious activity and a mild risk assessment. Now let's talk about St. Mark. Venice didn't just pick him out of a divine lineup, they stole him. Literally, in 828 CE, a pair of Venetian merchants traveled to Alexandria, Egypt, where Mark the Evangelist had been buried for centuries. Unfortunately for Egypt, but very fortunately for Venice, they were not above a little holy body snatching. They smuggled his remains back to the lagoon by hiding the body in a barrel of pork to evade Muslim inspectors. You read that correctly. Venice's most revered relic made its way to Italy, nestled among bacon slabs. When the relics arrived, the Doge and the citizens went wild. Mark became the city's patron saint. His winged lion symbol was slapped on every building and coin, and the basilica in his honor was rebuilt multiple times, presumably to say, "Sorry we hid you in ham, buddy." The St. Mark incident wasn't an isolated case. Venice's religious fervor had a very pragmatic twist. Relics weren't just spiritual treasures, they were tourist bait and civic trophies. the more finger bones, scraps of robe, or surprisingly intact saintly teeth you could display, the more pilgrims would flock to your altars, bringing money, prestige, and conveniently timed political influence. Thus, Venetian churches were stocked like macabre antique shops. Did you want a splinter from the true cross? Done. A piece of the Virgin Mary's veil. You got it. An entire arm of some obscure 3rd century martyr. That's aisle 3. Despite all this religious theatre, Venice was not a theocracy. Far from it. In fact, the relationship between the Venetian church and the secular republic was more, it's complicated than divine harmony. The republic wanted control over everything, politics, law, even some bits of morality, but it didn't want the Pope poking his nose into Venetian affairs, ever. This led to awkward, prolonged tensions. For example, the republic often appointed bishops and abbots without papal permission, a bold move that occasionally landed them in hot water. When Pope Paul V placed Venice under interdict in 1606, meaning no sacraments for anyone, the city basically shrugged and said, fine, we'll just have our own masses with blackjack and incense. They continued religious services anyway, staffed by loyal clergy who gave Rome the metaphorical finger while wearing embroidered vestments. Venice didn't do subtlety. Its religious calendar was packed with lavish feasts, Saints' Day parades, and flotillas of candle-lit gondolas. One standout ritual was the Festa della Senza, a symbolic marriage between Venice and the sea, where the Doge would ride out into the lagoon and toss a golden ring into the water. Spiritual meaning aside, it was also an excuse for a citywide party, complete with enough wine to sink a monastery. Of course, conducting all this sacred business on unstable terrain had its setbacks. During particularly aggressive aqua alta, high tides, altars would flood, pews floated away, and pious Venetians would find themselves confessing sins while knee-deep in lagoon water. But did they cancel Mass? Never. This is Venice, where holy water occasionally comes from under the door. Religion in Venice wasn't just about piety, it was a form of public relations. The grandeur of its churches told visitors, we may be floating on a swamp, but we are blessed by heaven itself. The Republic funded grand basilicas not just to please God, but to show off wealth, power, and independence. A city that could build a marble cathedral on mud clearly had divine favor, or at least very confident engineers. So while other cities turned to the heavens for salvation, Venice turned to relics, rituals, and a really sturdy pair of stilts. And if they had to bend the rules or a few papal decrees to get what they wanted, well, as the Venetians might say, mea culpa, but the view is worth it. Carnival in Venice, a time when reality put on a mask, the wine flowed like canal water, and social rules took an extended holiday. For weeks, the city transformed into one big masquerade ball that included everything from opera to orgies, sometimes both at once. It was glittery, chaotic, seductive, and just the right amount of criminal. The line between celebration and scandal didn't blur so much as dissolve completely in a haze of perfume, confetti, and morally questionable decisions. Venetian Carnival wasn't just a party, it was an institution. By the time the 18th century rolled around, Carnival had ballooned into an annual social purge valve. And we're not talking a cozy weekend of dancing and wine. We're talking 40 days. Yes, days of decadent excess, where the entire population, from nobles to commoners, got to wear masks and pretend they weren't themselves. Because nothing says wholesome Catholic fun like hiding your identity and making out with your neighbor's spouse while dressed like a Roman demigod. In normal society, masks are what people wear to rob banks or survive pandemics. But in Venice, masks were worn to rob virtue. The bolter, the classic white mask with a jutting chin and no mouth, was designed so the wearer could eat, drink, and whisper secrets without ever revealing who they were. Paired with a long cloak and tricorn hat, the look screamed, I'm mysterious, probably rich, and definitely up to no good. Then there was the mortetta, a black velvet oval worn by women and held in place by biting a button inside the mask with their teeth. That's right, women literally couldn't talk while wearing it. Combine that with an opulent dress, and it was like walking around in mysterious, silent protest fashion. But these masks weren't just for flair, they were the great Venetian equalizer. In a city obsessed with class distinctions, Carnival allowed a fishmonger to party like a prince, or a duchess to disappear into a back alley with a handsome gondolier. No one knew who was who. It was anonymous chaos, with sequins. Now imagine the consequences of everyone wearing a disguise while drunk and emotionally repressed. Exactly chaos. The annual crime spike during Carnival wasn't just a small uptick. Pickpockets, thieves, and gentlemen of opportunity all took advantage of the fact that you couldn't positively identify anyone. How do you arrest someone for stabbing a merchant if everyone at the party is wearing the same mask and half of them are already passed out in the Grand Canal? Duels were also not uncommon, with honor being something Venetians held onto like gold bullion. A few misplaced words, or an uninvited hand on the wrong corset, could quickly lead to drawn swords and a very theatrical death in a candlelit alley. Even the government threw its hands up. The Council of Ten, Venice's spooky secretive overlords, tried issuing decrees against masks outside of Carnival season, but within Carnival, it was open season for drama. Venice went all in on Carnival. Theatres ran non-stop plays and operas. Jugglers, fire eaters, and questionable acrobats swarmed the streets. Aristocrats threw lavish masked balls, and foreign visitors flocked in with purses ready, and morals packed away in their luggage. Casanova himself used Carnival as his personal playground because of course he did. But all that fun came at a price. Venetian Carnival might have looked like a fairy tale, but the aftermath was less charming. By the end of the festivities, the city was often hungover in every sense of the word. The streets reeked of wine, sweat, and spilled secrets. Illicit children were conceived. Fortunes were lost in backroom gambling dens. And more than one person woke up in a mask they didn't remember putting on, next to a stranger whose name they'd never learn. Church leaders condemned Carnival regularly, of course, right up until they disappeared into the festivities wearing masks themselves. Because let's be honest, even cardinals need a little escapism sometimes, especially when it involves powdered wigs and dramatic opera monologues. Underneath all the feathers and revelry was something deeper. Carnival was the city's way of forgetting the political backstabbing, forgetting the rising stink in the canals, forgetting the plague pits and the slow financial decline. When everything was crumbling, you might as well do it in style, preferably while wearing satin and drinking wine from a golden goblet. But even this grand illusion couldn't last forever. By the late 18th century, Venice was losing power, and the government began scaling Carnival back. The Austrians, after taking over Venice in 1798, banned the celebration altogether for a time, seeing it as a dangerous breeding ground for subversion and STDs. It wasn't until centuries later that the modern revival of Carnival began, less crime-filled and slightly more touristy, but still dripping in costume and nostalgia. Venetian Carnival was a symphony of seduction, silliness, and social subversion. It was where you could dance with a duke, kiss a criminal, and wake up wondering if that really was a duel you got into, or just a very aggressive mime performance. It was Mardi Gras meets The Godfather with a splash of perfume and a whole lot of scandal. And though Venice today might be more selfie sticks than stabbings, the spirit of Carnival lingers. Proof that even a city built on water knows how to throw a party that makes the rest of Europe look like it's stuck in Lent. Before humanity had the luxury of flicking a match and lighting up a cozy fire or a birthday cake, there was an entire era defined by our collective struggle to not freeze to death. Starting a fire in ancient times was less light it and forget it, and more initiate full-body cardio session and pray to every available deity for sparks. Forget your fancy long-reach lighters or strike-anywhere sticks. You had two tools, hope and desperation, and neither produced flames quickly. Let's begin with the classics. Flint and steel. Sounds rugged, romantic, and possibly a little cool until you try it. Imagine crouching for 20 sweaty minutes in a cave, smashing rocks together, only to produce a single lonely spark that lands on your kindling like it's questioning all of its life choices. If you were lucky, that spark might catch. If not, well, back to banging rocks like a frustrated Neanderthal drummer. And then there's friction fire, the old rub two sticks together method. This was the ancient equivalent of doing push-ups while solving a puzzle. You needed dry wood, good technique, steady hands, and the patience of a saint. One popular method was the bow drill. Wrap a cord around a vertical stick, push down hard, while soaring back and forth with the bow until smoke rises. Sounds fun? It wasn't. It was exhausting, blister-inducing, and gave off the vibe of a caveman desperately trying to win a reality show. But hey, once that precious ember appeared, you weren't done. No, you had to nurture it like a very fragile, smoky baby. You'd gently place the ember into a tinder bundle, dry grass, bark shavings, maybe some beard lint, and blow on it like you were wooing it. If you did it right, flames. If you did it wrong, smoke in your eyes and shame in your soul. For those a bit more advanced and wealthier, there were fire pistons, clever little devices that used rapid air compression to generate heat and ignite a small piece of tinder. Think of them as prehistoric lighters, except they only worked under perfect conditions, which nature rarely offered. The fire piston basically said, "I'll make a spark, but only if you're better than me at everything." Ancient Egyptians and Greeks also used sun mirrors, polished bronze or glass that concentrated sunlight onto a focal point. This was great if the sun was out, but since weather is famously cooperative, you were often left holding a shiny bowl and glaring at the clouds while muttering something sacrilegious. It was essentially solar power for pyromaniacs. Now, once a fire was going, maintaining it was a whole different trial. That's where slow burn tools came in. Punk wood, char cloth, or ember baskets, literal baskets holding coals like a flaming picnic. These were carried around to keep embers alive through the day. So yes, people just casually strolled through markets with fiery pouches on their hips like walking fire hazards. OSHA would have had a meltdown. And candles. Those weren't exactly reliable fire starters either. Early versions were made from tallow, animal fat that smelled like old socks and burned like disappointment. The light they provided was dim, smoky, and prone to setting things ablaze if you sneezed near them. But at least they saved you from rubbing sticks together during dinner. Fire making was so laborious, in fact, that many households had a designated firekeeper, someone whose job was to never let the hearth flame go out. It was a position of both importance and eternal anxiety. Let the flame die, and you'd be explaining to your freezing family why they had to start rubbing sticks together again. You might as well have forgotten to feed the livestock and insulted the gods in the same breath. And heaven help you if you were a traveller. Inns didn't just offer beds and ale, they had something much more valuable, a lit fire. Travellers often carried fire-starting kits, complete with flint, tinder, and a quiet sense of dread. The open road was cold, dangerous, and full of flammable regrets. So, in a world before matches, lighting a fire was less of a chore and more of a survival event. It was sweaty, smoky, and occasionally involved bleeding fingers. You didn't light a fire, you earned it. The good news? If you did manage to spark a flame, you were a hero. The bad news? It only took a gust of wind, a sneeze, or a poorly placed goat to take it all away. By the late 1600s, humanity was tired of playing caveman every time it wanted to roast a chestnut or light a ceremonial beard on fire. Science was on the rise, alchemists were getting nosy with nature, and the Enlightenment was right around the corner, shouting, "Let there be light, but let it be slightly more explosive." Enter the early chemists, brilliant, reckless, and frequently missing eyebrows. They were the kind of people who saw a glowing rock and thought, "I should probably grind this up and inhale it." Among them was Johann Joachim Becher, a man who helped pave the way for a new era of chemistry, where fire wasn't summoned with sticks, it was engineered. Becher, a 17th century German physician, alchemist, and all-around mad scientist, became one of the first thinkers to explore the flammable potential of various chemical elements. While he didn't invent matches per se, he cracked open the door that would lead future inventors into the fiery rabbit hole of phosphorus-based experimentation. His work contributed to what was known as the phlogiston theory. an early and wildly incorrect idea that all combustible materials contained a fire-like element called phlogiston, which was released when something burned. Spoiler alert, it was nonsense, but the kind of nonsense that gave people ideas. And what did people do with those ideas? They set things on fire, scientifically. Throughout the 1700s, curious chemists began isolating and experimenting with elements like sulfur, antimony, and especially phosphorus, a substance that glowed ominously in the dark, smelled like garlic's evil twin, and had the delightful habit of spontaneously combusting in air. Phosphorus was first isolated in 1669 by Hennig Brand, a man who discovered it by boiling urine. Yes, gallons of it. Apparently, 17th century science required not just brilliance but a complete disregard for dignity and nose function. Brand was trying to turn pee into gold, as one does, but instead created a substance that glowed eerily and caught fire if you so much as breathed near it too hard. Naturally, it became the new toy for Europe's experimental elite. Fast forward to the 18th century, and these volatile elements were being mixed, matched, and struck against anything that didn't immediately scream fire hazard. The early matchstick prototypes of this time weren't the sleek, paper-wrapped wonders we know today. Oh no, they were little sticks of suicidal ambition dipped in combustible paste, soaked in chemicals, and absolutely ready to ruin your day. Some designs required dipping the stick into a separate vial of sulfuric acid to ignite, because nothing says user-friendly like carrying around an acid bottle in your waistcoat. Others involved pressing the stick against rough surfaces and hoping it sparked before it exploded. These early versions worked, occasionally. The results ranged from dazzling flame to mild explosion to losing feeling in your fingertips. One especially ambitious design in the late 1700s was the chlorate match, which used potassium chlorate and sugar to create a mini combustion when struck. It was powerful, flashy, and completely unreliable. It was like lighting a cigarette with a firework, occasionally dramatic, frequently illegal, definitely dangerous. And while these matches didn't yet earn widespread use, they did spark literally the public imagination. People saw the potential portable fire at your fingertips. Unfortunately, the fire often reached your fingertips and sometimes continued to your sleeves, your house, or your wig. Safety protocols, user testing, and FDA approval were centuries away. Despite the dangers, inventors were undeterred. This was the chemical arms race of combustion, and everyone wanted to be the first to harness controlled fire in stick form. Scientists published dramatic papers, held public demonstrations, some with explosions that cleared entire auditoriums, and kept tinkering, refining chemical ratios, trying new ignition techniques, and occasionally inventing accidental smoke bombs in the process. To add extra flair to the chaos, early pyrotechnic tinkerers weren't just chemists, they were also showmen. In Enlightenment salons and royal courts, you could watch a gentleman set fire to a magic stick with the flick of a wrist, followed by polite clapping and the very real possibility of scorched curtains. It was entertainment, it was science, it was a health and safety nightmare. In short, this period was less, hey, let's make a match, and more, what if I turn this chemical into portable inferno? Progress was being made, yes, but it was messy, hazardous, and frequently involved running from an unexpected fireball. Yet, every chemical experiment, every exploded glove, every panicked scientist diving behind a table, brought humanity closer to something miraculous. Fire on demand, without a bow drill, a tinderbox, or an emergency prayer. John Walker was a man with two talents, an eye for chemistry, and apparently an astonishing disregard for his own safety. In 1826, inside his modest chemist's shop in Stockton-on-Tees, England, Walker accidentally invented something that would transform daily life and make spontaneous combustion a little too easy. His creation? The friction match, a tool so convenient and volatile that it earned the charming nickname Lucifer. Walker wasn't even trying to invent a match. He was experimenting with chemical mixtures in an attempt to create a new kind of lighting material, possibly a better lamp igniter. What he ended up with was a volatile concoction of antimony sulfide and potassium chlorate pasted onto the end of a wooden stick. One fateful evening, after stirring the mix with a stick, he scraped it against the floor, and poof, a sudden burst of flame. It was either divine inspiration or a polite invitation to the nearest fire brigade. You'd think Walker would run out and patent his invention immediately, but no, he was a chemist, not a businessman, and thought the invention was too trivial for legal protection. This is the historical equivalent of discovering the iPhone and then handing it out like Halloween candy. Instead, he began selling the matches from his shop under the name Friction Lights, packaged in little boxes with a piece of sandpaper for ignition. For about $1, you could now carry the power of fire in your pocket. No more rubbing sticks or begging your neighbor for a lit taper. Except there was a catch. Actually, there were several. For one, the early matches were completely uncoated, meaning they'd spark at the faintest provocation. Drop the box and whoops, your trousers are now a cautionary tale. The mix was dangerously unstable. Lucifers were known to ignite when jostled, stepped on, or even stared at with too much intensity. They didn't just light your pipe, they lit the room, the drapes, and possibly your cat. Also the smell. These early matches gave off a noxious stench of sulfur and dead hope. Lighting one in a small room meant everyone would gag, flee, or assume a demon had arrived for tea. But the thrill of instant fire outweighed the inconvenience of possibly burning your own eyebrows off, and sales spread quickly. Walker's invention wasn't an overnight success, but it caught on rapidly among the risk-tolerant. Within a few years, Lucifers were being sold across Europe. The name itself was wonderfully appropriate. Lucifer, the light bringer, also happened to be the Prince of Hell, perfect branding for a product that made fire appear out of thin air and occasionally exploded without warning. Curiously, Walker refused to mass-produce his matches. He didn't want the hassle or the fame, so naturally someone else did. Enter Samuel Jones, a businessman who took Walker's invention, rebranded it, still calling them Lucifers but with better marketing, and sold them like hotcakes. Jones became rich. Walker stayed behind the chemist's counter, probably muttering something about capitalism and singed fingers. But while these early friction matches were revolutionary, they were not refined. The ignition process was inconsistent, and sometimes you'd scrape your match for minutes before anything happened, at which point it might flare up like a miniature sun. They were banned in some public places for being too hazardous. Lighting up in church could be considered both sacrilegious and a fire code violation. Still, people embraced the chaos. For the first time in human history, fire was truly portable. Campfires, cooking stoves, candles, all could be lit in seconds, without starting a one-man Renaissance fair of flint and steel. People didn't have to plan their day around the communal hearth or carry embers around like medieval hamsters. Of course, the match's arrival also meant the rise of new habits, some charming, others alarming. Smoking became more common because now you could light up just about anywhere. Children discovered the joys of playing with fire, and insurance adjusters discovered a spike in claims. Domestic arson had never been so accessible. Walker didn't live to see how transformative his invention would become, nor did he ever make serious money from it. He died in 1859, still relatively obscure, still humble about his contribution, but every time someone casually struck a match and didn't scream in horror, they owed a little nod of thanks to the man who gave fire a wooden stick and said, "Good luck." And the name Lucifer, it stuck around for a while, but eventually faded as companies found more family-friendly ways to market sticks that burst into flame. Still, you can't deny the dramatic flair. "Pass me a Lucifer" just sounds cooler than "got a match." Let's set the stage. Victorian England, a place where the skies were grey, the morals were rigid, and the air was thick with soot, smog, and ambition. And somewhere in the smog-choked maze of London's industrial sprawl, thousands of young women and girls were hunched over benches in match factories, inhaling chemicals more dangerous than their bosses' financial ethics. Welcome to the world of the matchstick girls, where the pay was low, the fumes were high, and your jaw might just glow in the dark before falling off. The 1800s were peak industrial revolution. Everything was being mass-produced. Textiles, soap, misery, and matches were no exception. The friction match had become an everyday item by this point. No longer did you have to pray to Prometheus every time you wanted a candle lit. But behind the convenience was an industry powered by the cheapest labor imaginable. Working-class women and girls, many as young as 12, earning a few pennies a day to dip wooden sticks into a chemical cocktail that was more villain origin story than workplace hazard. The real star of this horror show, white phosphorus. White phosphorus is like the toxic X of the periodic table. It's highly reactive, glows ominously in the dark, and bursts into flames when exposed to air. It also has the charming tendency to enter your bloodstream if you inhale enough of it, which, spoiler alert, match workers absolutely did. The factory air was thick with it. The result? A truly nightmarish condition called phossy jaw. Imagine your jawbone deciding it no longer wants to be part of your face and instead attempts an early retirement by rotting from the inside out. That's phossy jaw. The first signs were toothaches, swelling, and a strange glow. Yes, a glow coming from inside the mouth. If you were unlucky, bits of your jaw would eventually disintegrate. If you were really unlucky, the infection would spread, and your employer would casually fire you because having visible necrosis was considered bad for morale. The employers, bless their black-hearted souls, were more interested in profit than worker safety. Protective gear? Ventilation? Only if you count the hole in the roof. Medical treatment? You got some vinegar and a vague suggestion to try not to breathe so much. Yet despite the Dickensian gloom, these matchstick girls were not passive victims. In 1888, they reached their boiling point. It started at the Bryant and May factory in East London, one of the largest match manufacturers at the time. The company's strategy for labor relations was simple: underpay everyone, punish anyone who complained, and fine workers for everything from talking to having dirty hands, which, yes, is absurd when your entire job involves dipping wood into sticky chemicals. But one summer, the match girls decided they'd had enough of the glowing jaws and the glowing hypocrisy. Around 1,400 of them walked out in a strike that stunned the public, and more importantly embarrassed the company into doing something other than looking the other way. The Match Girls' strike of 1888 became one of the earliest and most impactful labor movements in Britain. It was organized, fierce, and led almost entirely by teenage girls who looked capitalism in the eye and said, "Try me." Their demands were simple: better wages, safer working conditions, and an end to the ridiculous fines that shaved their already meager earnings. They got support from social reformers like Annie Besant, a journalist and activist who championed their cause in print and helped the strike gain national attention. Under pressure from bad press, public protests, and the sheer force of girl-powered fury, Bryant and May folded. They agreed to many of the demands, including better conditions and the right to form a union. While the strike didn't instantly end the use of white phosphorus that would take international pressure and another couple decades, it marked a turning point. The public could no longer pretend these factories were harmless, and the match girls proved that even the most overlooked voices could light the fire of change, quite literally. And yes, eventually legislation caught up. By the early 1900s, many countries, including the UK, began phasing out white phosphorus in favor of the safer red phosphorus. But none of that would have happened so soon if it weren't for the match girls and their terrifying first-hand knowledge of what happens when you mix teenage labor with toxic fumes and unchecked greed. So the next time you strike a match, pause to remember, behind that tiny flicker of fire was a full-on labor war, chemical disaster and teenage rebellion, all in a day's work at a Victorian match factory. Lighting a fire in the 1800s was a lot like gambling. The stakes were high, the odds weren't great, and you might leave without your eyebrows. After decades of exploding Lucifers and glow-in-the-dark poison sticks, humanity finally began to rethink the whole let's put literal death on a stick approach. Enter Gustav Erik Pasch, the Swedish inventor who decided enough was enough. If fire was humanity's best friend, it probably shouldn't try to kill you every time you said hello. Pasch was a man of science, a professor, and a chemist who looked at white phosphorus, the same ingredient causing workers' jaws to rot, and thought, Surely there's a less murdery version of this. The result: red phosphorus. Unlike its evil twin, red phosphorus didn't spontaneously combust in your pocket, and it didn't produce fumes that made your face melt like a horror movie extra. This was progress. Not perfection, mind you, but the bar was so low at this point that merely surviving a match lighting experience felt like a luxury. The safety match that Pash developed in 1844 was a quiet revolution. Instead of putting the phosphorus on the match head like the Lucifers, Pash moved it to a special striking surface on the matchbox. That meant the match wouldn't ignite unless deliberately scraped along that surface. In theory, this prevented the kind of surprise combustions that had turned many a Victorian trouser pocket into a brief but intense fireworks show. You now had to work for your fire, and that was considered a good thing. However, innovation doesn't always equal instant fame or fortune. Pash's design was clever, but his safety matches didn't really catch on at first. The red phosphorus was expensive to produce and even trickier to handle, so ironically, the safer match sat on the shelf while people kept buying the ones that came with a side of potential hospitalization. It took another Swede, Johan Edvard Lundström, to refine the idea into something that was actually manufacturable and marginally less wallet-destroying. Lundström's version, introduced in the 1850s, would become the standard bearer for matches that didn't act like tiny assassins. This is where Sweden steps in, not just as the land of fjords and ABBA, but as the unexpected kingpin of global fire. By the late 19th century, the Swedish match industry had become a flaming juggernaut. Through a mix of smart innovation and a little economic wizardry, Sweden established a near monopoly on safety match production. In fact, at one point in the early 20th century, the Swedish match company controlled an estimated 75% of the world's match trade. That's right, Sweden owned the fire game like it was collecting Pokemon cards. And this was no sleepy little export business. Matches were serious global currency. You needed them to light your stove, your lanterns, your cigars, your temper. In a world where electricity hadn't quite finished its global victory lap, a match wasn't just convenience, it was survival. Sweden essentially held the keys to ignition, and they knew it. The match trade was so profitable that the match king Ivar Kreuger, no relation to Freddie, though arguably just as sinister in the financial world, became one of the richest men on earth before his empire famously collapsed in a heap of fraud and flame. Of course, even safety matches had their limits. Calling them safe was like calling a leaky rowboat unsinkable. They were safer, yes, but still capable of catching an entire household on fire if used improperly. Which, let's be honest, was most of the time. Children still loved sticking them where they didn't belong. Smokers still lit them while doused in alcohol. And arsonists, well, they appreciated the consistency. Still, the arrival of safety matches marked a critical turning point. No longer did you need to gamble with your facial features to light a candle. And for once, match workers weren't dying in slow, phosphorescent agony. The invention didn't just make dinner prep less perilous. It became a quiet but vital chapter in industrial reform, chemical science, and good old-fashioned not burning to death. So next time you strike a match and only get fire, not an impromptu chemical reaction or a lawsuit, give a little nod to Pash and Lundström. They made fire boring again, and in this case, boring was glorious. By the turn of the 20th century, matches had already graduated from deadly science experiment to household staple. But their glow-up wasn't finished. They were about to go global, not just in function, but in fashion, culture, and yes, even romance. Forget roses and handwritten letters. By the 1920s, slipping someone a matchbook with your number scribbled inside was the smouldering equivalent of "wanna get dinner." Once safety matches had been tamed, or at least made less murdery, they spread like fire. America, never one to turn down a good blaze, enthusiastically adopted matches as fast as it could. By the 1850s, domestic production was booming. American factories, powered by child labor and enough sawdust to flammabilize a small city, began churning out matches by the millions. If you had hands, odds were good you had matches in them. Meanwhile, Matches flickered across Asia, Japan, which had always maintained a healthy fascination with the balance between elegance and utility, embraced match manufacturing in the late 19th century, and swiftly became one of the world's leading exporters. Japanese matchboxes were miniature masterpieces, each one a hand-painted, finely crafted slice of aesthetic combustion. Think of it like origami. If origami could set your drapes on fire, by the early 20th century you could strike a match on nearly every continent, in nearly every language. They were universal, democratic, and absolutely everywhere. And while they were undeniably practical, lighting stoves, lanterns, cigarettes, and hopes, they were also quietly becoming cultural artifacts. That's when matchbooks happened. Now, to be clear, matchbooks weren't invented by poets or artists. They were invented by a Philadelphia patent lawyer named Joshua Pusey in 1892. Like any good invention, his creation came out of mild irritation. Kersey, a cigar smoker, was fed up with lugging bulky boxes of matches around, so he created a thin, foldable paperboard matchbook with a little striker strip inside. They were light, they were cheap, they were kindling in your pocket, literally. Unfortunately for Pusey, he sold the rights almost immediately to the Diamond Match Company, who had the marketing budget, distribution power, and pure capitalist gusto to make matchbooks the go-to promotional tool of the 20th century. Diamond soon realized these weren't just fire starters. They were blank canvases begging to be filled with logos, slogans, hotel names, and the occasional softcore pin-up. A book of matches became your ticket stub, business card, conversation starter, and emotional crutch. Restaurants, nightclubs, airlines, funeral homes, yes, even those. Every business wanted their brand burned into public consciousness. And what better way than something you saw every time you lit your smoke, your candle, or your ex-boyfriend's love letters. By mid-century, matchbooks were a free souvenir you could pick up at the counter, tuck in your purse, and leave on your nightstand like a flammable breadcrumb trail of everywhere you'd been. Hotels, in particular, loved them. There's something deliciously absurd about a 5-star suite handing you a matchbook with your complimentary soap and shower cap. Enjoy your stay. Here's something to help you accidentally burn it down. But it worked. Hotels weren't just giving you fire, they were giving you a branded experience. A Hilton matchbook was a low-cost luxury with high visibility, and it fit in your pocket, unlike the concierge. Even politics got in on the flame game. Campaigns in the US printed matchbooks with slogans like "Light up with Lyndon" or "Strike with Ike." Nothing says democracy like literally lighting your candidate's face on fire to toast a marshmallow. Matchbooks also became curiously romantic. People left flirtatious messages inside. Bartenders wrote phone numbers on the covers. Matchbooks turned into mini diaries of relationships that may or may not have gone up in smoke. They were passed between lovers, strangers, salesmen, and arsonists alike. At their peak, they weren't just useful, they were emotional artifacts, and collectors took notice. Philomenists, yes, that's the real word for people who collect matchbooks and matchboxes, started hoarding them by the thousands. Some were drawn to the artistry, others were drawn to the nostalgia, a few probably just really liked cardboard. Regardless, matchbooks became a legitimate collectible, preserving a century's worth of branding, culture, and weirdly specific restaurant phone numbers. But for all their cultural mileage, matchbooks eventually flickered. Disposable lighters, smoking bans, and safety concerns gradually pushed them into the realm of novelty. Fewer restaurants handed them out, fewer pockets carried them, and fewer people remembered a time when branding literally came with sparks. Still, they left a legacy, not just of scorched fingertips, but of the moment when something as simple as starting a fire became an expression of who you were, where you'd been, and what you might set ablaze next. If the 19th century invented the match, the 20th century fell in love with it. And not just in a "I need to light my stove" way, but more like "I'm keeping this tiny box because it has a cartoon squirrel on it and smells like adventure." In this chapter we descend into the smoky, artsy, and occasionally romantic world of the matchstick's golden age, where design met addiction, and everybody carried a little box of potential fire in their pocket, like it was just a normal Tuesday. Let's talk addiction first. The 20th century was, to put it gently, a very smoky place. If you didn't smoke, you at least pretended to while standing in a foggy jazz club holding a drink that smelled like regret and mint, and cigarettes, of course, demanded fire. Enter the match, humble, portable, and always ready to set something ablaze, whether it was a lucky strike, a signal flare, or your uncle's beard when he leaned in too close. Smokers and matches were the perfect codependent couple. One couldn't function without the other. If you had a cigarette and no fire, you were just holding a rolled-up paper tube like a disappointed magician. But matches? They delivered with flair. There was drama in the strike, satisfaction in the hiss, and a tiny thrill every time you didn't set your sleeves on fire. And don't even get us started on matchbox art. Somewhere along the way, manufacturers realized people didn't just want functional matches, they wanted fabulous matches. Suddenly, matchboxes were no longer bland cardboard rectangles, but miniature billboards of artistic expression, from bold geometric designs to absurdly detailed cartoons. These matchboxes became collectible items. Countries like Japan, India, and the USSR turned them into canvas-worthy gems, sometimes with odd slogans like "Be alert, not ash," "Use me before I use you." Need a lion dressed as a gentleman lighting a match with his monocle? There's a matchbox for that. Want a depiction of a rooster chasing a cigarette through a field of abstract swirls? Why wouldn't you? Matchbox collectors called philumenists. Yes, that's a real word, and no, they didn't make it up to win Scrabble. It was part design, part history, and part a glorious excuse to say, no, I'm not a hoarder, I'm preserving culture. But it wasn't all domestic leisure and aesthetic appreciation. Matches played a surprisingly tough role in World Wars too. Soldiers in World War I and II often carried matchbooks as essentials, not luxuries. Matches lit trench cigarettes, campfires, lanterns, and occasionally the enemy's nerves. During these wars, matchbooks were printed with morale-boosting messages like "Strike a blow for victory" or "Light up for liberty," which is arguably one of the few times in history when lighting something on fire was considered patriotic. Some matches even came equipped with survival instructions printed on the inside cover: how to build a shelter, identify edible plants, or signal a rescue plane without accidentally starting a forest fire. Talk about multitasking. And let's not forget, matches were waterproofed, windproofed, and sometimes even disguised in spy kits. Because nothing says espionage like setting someone's confidential documents ablaze while pretending to light a cigarette. Back on the home front, matchbooks became promotional currency. Businesses realized, hey, people love setting things on fire. What if we printed our logo on it? Suddenly, every diner, hotel, and bowling alley had its own branded matchbook. Going to a fancy restaurant? Don't forget your free matchbook with every creme brulee. Checking into a hotel? Here's a complimentary matchbook to remember us by. Nothing screams hospitality like a portable ignition source. It got to the point where giving someone a matchbook was practically a courtship ritual. If you handed someone a matchbook with your number scrawled on the back, it meant, "I like you." Also, here's something flammable to remember me by. It was Tinder before Tinder, only with a much higher risk of third-degree burns. And the slogans. Oh, the slogans. Matchbook covers weren't just art, they were sass. You'd see lines like "Don't strike me, strike a match," or "Hot stuff inside," written in twirly fonts that made you wonder whether you'd picked up a box of fire or a flirty post-it note. Some warned you to keep matches away from children. Others basically dared you to try. Strike me if you dare. Subtlety was not in the marketing brief. By mid-century, matches were everywhere. In nightclubs, bus terminals, doctors' offices, yes, really, and even churches. One wonders what the religious implications were of giving worshippers a box of fire. But hey, lighting a votive candle had to start somewhere. Of course, all this glory didn't last forever, as lighters became cheaper and safer, and as smoking slowly lost its cultural shine, matches fell out of favor. But for decades, these tiny sticks of combustion were more than just tools. They were accessories, symbols, and accidental art projects. So yes, matches were addictive in every way, visually, socially, and literally if you were a smoker. They sparked wars, lit romances, and decorated millions of ashtrays, and all from a tiny stick of treated wood, wrapped in whimsy and occasionally poor decisions. Because in the 20th century you weren't truly living unless you were carrying a box of artwork you could set on fire. There was a time when matches were the MVPs of daily life, the fire-starting equivalent of Wi-Fi. Without them, your candles sat dark, your stove stayed cold, and your cigarettes went tragically unlit. But today, matches are a little like dial-up internet, once revolutionary, now mostly forgotten, until a hipster cafe hands you a matchbook with your artisanal grilled cheese. Let's be clear, matches aren't extinct, they're just having an identity crisis. The once fiery symbol of human ingenuity now mostly lives in the back of your kitchen drawer, next to expired batteries and that one weird screw you swear belongs to something. The match's slow decline began innocently enough in the mid-20th century with the rise of lighters. Lighters didn't smell like sulfur, didn't break in half in your pocket, and didn't require a small blood sacrifice to ignite. Disposable butane lighters became the match's cooler, more convenient cousin, the one that shows up to parties in a leather jacket and actually works in the wind. Then came gas stoves with push-button ignition, fireplaces with remote controls, because nothing says I love the primal energy of fire like pressing on from your couch, and eventually the digital revolution, when your phone can summon dinner, turn off the lights and adjust your thermostat. Manually striking a match feels like playing fetch with a dinosaur. Even smokers moved on, with smoking bans, vaping trends and lighters built into keychains. The matchbox's social life took a nosedive. Its once fiery romance with nicotine was replaced by rechargeable USB vapes that look like miniature sci-fi weapons. The modern match, left in the friend zone. And yet somehow the humble match persists. You'll still find them stashed in emergency kits, camping supplies, or that one drawer that doubles as a time capsule. Why? Because when society collapses and the power grid goes down, your scented candle won't light itself, and your USB lighter will be as useful as a chocolate teapot. Matches are also favored in the world of survivalism, where rubbing two sticks together is noble, but striking a match is just more efficient when you're cold and possibly being hunted by a bear. In these circles, waterproof matches, stormproof matches, and matches that can light after being dunked in soup are still being manufactured with the same enthusiasm we used to reserve for moon landings. Restaurants and bars, especially the ones that charge $18 for a cocktail served in a boot, still hand out branded matchbooks as a nod to old-school charm. Nothing says authenticity like a free packet of tiny explosives next to your creme brulee. But while their practical function has flickered, matches have reignited something else entirely: nostalgia. There is now an entire subculture of people who collect matchboxes, and not because they enjoy setting things on fire. These modern match aficionados treat the tiny cardboard books like pieces of historical art, which, to be fair, they kind of are. From mid-century Vegas casinos, to 1960s airlines to obscure Polish jazz clubs, matchbooks once served as miniature billboards for the world. Their designs are bold, weird, often unintentionally hilarious, and these days insanely collectible. Some matchbooks from defunct hotels or iconic old diners sell for more than the original meal ever did. Nothing says capitalism like turning disposable fire tools into luxury nostalgia. The slogans are part of the charm. Light my fire, a spark of hospitality, smoke in style, equal parts marketing and melodrama. And then there are the safety warnings, often in fine print and always ignored. Keep away from children, do not ignite near face, and the ever-popular, caution flammable, just in case someone thought it was a breath mint. Even Hollywood got the memo. Matches now feature in moody, stylized scenes where a single strike signals drama, romance, or an approaching apocalypse. Wes Anderson films practically demand you carry a matchbook with ironic flair. It's no longer about starting a fire, it's about starting aesthetic. So while matches may have lost their monopoly on combustion, they've gained something arguably more enduring: cultural relevance. They've been elevated from household necessity to vintage art piece, survivalist essential, and ironic fashion statement. Not bad for a sulfur-dipped stick of wood. And sure, you can light your candles with a flameless USB wand that looks like a taser for insects. But where's the drama in that? A match crackles. It hisses. It smells faintly of risk. It reminds us of a time when making fire was an act of agency, not an app feature. In the end, the match still burns. If not in our hands, then at least in our memories, which is pretty impressive for a thing that's literally designed to destroy itself.